Now we begin with Story 1, The Quiet Pages, The Making of the Joseon Encyclopedia. You wake to the gentle scrape of a bamboo pen. The room is quiet, save for the subtle rustle of parchment and the distant chirp of a morning bird. It is the 15th century in the kingdom of Joseon. You are not a king, nor a general, nor a court lady. You are a scribe. Your job is not to rule, but to record. And your task today is one of staggering ambition, compiling the knowledge of an entire civilization. This is the story of how Korea's most ambitious knowledge project was born not in battle or with fanfare, but in quiet rooms filled with ink, smoke, and the dogged persistence of men who copied, cross-referenced, and debated every line. It is the story of the Jibong Useol, the Uigui, and later, the Jujingak and Joseon Silak, some of the most comprehensive records of history, culture, and bureaucracy in East Asia. Let's begin not with a finished book, but with a question. A nation's need for memory. The Joseon dynasty, 1392–1897, emerged from the ashes of Goryeo, a kingdom weakened by Mongol domination and internal corruption. The new regime, founded by Yeseongjai, was deeply Confucian in its vision. Unlike the Buddhist-friendly Goryeo, Joseon was concerned with order, hierarchy, and bureaucracy. Confucianism, after all, is a philosophy obsessed with structure of heaven, of state, of family, and of mind. And in the Joseon context, order could not be maintained without record. Without documentation, there could be no continuity, no law, no tradition, no future. Thus, in the quiet corridors of palaces and provincial offices, a new breed of scholar began to take root. They were the Seonbai, morally upright, bookish, loyal to Confucian ideals. These were not warriors or wealthy merchants. They were often the second or third sons of minor officials, and they were driven by one purpose: to serve the state through scholarship. It was these scholars who would take on the daunting work of building Korea's state encyclopedias, beginning with fragmented notes, family registers, and court records. The Jibong Useol, a curious beginning. The first major encyclopedic work is credited to Yi Guang, a military officer and scholar who traveled to Ming China. Upon his return, he compiled the Jibong Useol, 1614, an early form of encyclopedic writing not sanctioned by the state but impressive in scope. It included everything from farming techniques to Chinese customs, foreign cultures, local dialects, and even medical practices. Yi Guang's work is remarkable for its curiosity. It marked the beginning of a broader recognition that knowledge, however mundane, was valuable. He cataloged how Ming bureaucrats organized their tax ledgers, how Vietnamese courtiers folded their robes, how Western missionaries translated the Bible, and how Korean peasants dealt with snake bites. In this way, encyclopedic writing in Joseon started not as an imperial commission, but as an intellectual survival strategy. Gather what you can and preserve it, for there may come a time when that knowledge saves lives. The Uigui, rituals recorded to perfection. If Yi Guang began the project with curiosity, the Joseon court institutionalized it with the Uigui. These were official manuals detailing state rituals, funerals, weddings, palace constructions, court protocol, even how to host an envoy from Beijing. What makes the Uigui extraordinary is its obsessive attention to detail. A royal funeral, for instance, was described not just in terms of who would attend, but how far apart participants would stand, the angle of their bows, the cloth of their garments, and even the color of thread used in banners. Why such detail? Because in the Confucian worldview, ritual is not performance, it is virtue made visible. To do it wrong is not just a misstep, it is a moral failing. So the scribes wrote and rewrote and revised. They debated how far a princess's palanquin should be carried before switching bearers. They cataloged the number of musicians in a royal procession and the sequence of court dishes in a diplomatic banquet. In these pages, history became heavy. It took up space in archives, It demanded storage, and above all, it demanded consistency. The scribes, quiet guardians of continuity. Imagine the life of a court scribe in the 17th century. You rise before dawn, your writing brush is trimmed, your inkstone is soaked. You are one of dozens assigned to transcribe today's record. You do not offer opinions. You do not skip details. Your job is to observe, document, and replicate. The scribes sat behind bamboo screens during court rituals, copying the words of the king and the deliberations of ministers. Their scrolls would be gathered, reviewed, and compiled into yearly annals. Errors were punished, often harshly. A mistranslation could result in flogging. A missing detail could delay an entire event. In this sense, scribes were historians and engineers of memory, laying foundations not in stone but in ink. And yet they were invisible. Their names rarely appear in the records they preserved. The birth of the Silak, history as a national archive. Eventually, this obsession with record-keeping culminated in the creation of the Joseon Wangjo Silak, the veritable records of the Joseon dynasty. Covering 472 years of history, over 1,893 volumes, the Silak was compiled by historiographers who were not even allowed to speak to the king. Their work was to observe without participation, to record without praise. These records were so valuable that multiple copies were made and hidden across the country in mountain archives like Gyeongjak-o and Tebiksen. Some were burned in invasions. Others survived by chance. A few still exist today, housed in specially designed archive temples. But the Silak was never meant for casual reading. Its language was formal, its prose dry, its focus exact. It was, in every sense, the ultimate boring document. And yet, within it, one finds the pulse of a kingdom, the marriage disputes of ministers, the market prices of barley, the sightings of comets, and the arguments over how many steps a funeral procession should include. The quiet power of paper. The scholars who built Korea's encyclopedic tradition did not wield swords or write poems. They made no declarations of war. They stirred no revolts. Instead, they copied the same paragraph for days, debated the correct height of a lantern, or noted the wind direction on a Tuesday morning. It is in these actions that the real infrastructure of a dynasty was laid, not with brick or steel, but with paper. In the end, knowledge was power not because it dazzled, but because it endured. But how did this encyclopedic impulse survive wars, invasions, and political purges? Why did it continue even when the kingdom itself was in decline? You stand in a mountain archive, the wooden beams heavy with the scent of aged pine. Before you are rows of wrapped scrolls, sealed in lacquered cases. There is no ornament here, just the austerity of function. These are the backups of Korea's memory, kept far from the court, away from fire, war, and political manipulation. This section of our story explores how the encyclopedia-making project in Joseon, Korea not only flourished, but also survived collapse, conquest, and time itself. What made record-keeping so durable in a kingdom that saw civil war, invasions from Japan and Manchuria, and constant political factionalism? The answer lies in a paradox. The more boring the record, the more fiercely it was protected. The archives hidden in the mountains. During the Imjin War, 1592-1598, Korea faced one of its most destructive invasions as Japanese forces under Toyotomi Hideyoshi swept through the peninsula. Cities burned, palaces fell, cultural treasures were looted or destroyed. Yet amidst the chaos, the kingdom made a surprising move. The government, recognizing the value of its historical records, ordered multiple sets of the Silak, the veritable records, to be moved and hidden in remote mountain repositories. These included archives like MT, Gyeongjak Archive, Gyeongjaksan. Located in today's Namyeongju, this became the official copy. MT, Odi Archive, Odison. Deep in Gangwon-do, known for isolation and preservation. MT Tebik Archive Tebikson, further south, built for redundancy. These archives were not simply storage units. They were sacred spaces, built like temples, guarded by appointed officials, and maintained by local scholars. They followed Confucian principles of spatial harmony and spiritual duty. Inside, the records were wrapped in silk, then sealed in lacquered chests. Conditions were controlled for humidity and temperature using ventilation systems made from stone slabs and chimney flues, primitive but effective. No one read these records casually. They were not for entertainment, nor even education. They were backups of national integrity, a blueprint of how the kingdom had once functioned should anyone one day need to reconstruct it. Post-war reconstruction, copying the past to rebuild the future. After the Japanese invasions ended, Joseon found itself in ruins. Libraries were looted, palaces reduced to ash. Skilled artisans had been kidnapped. The capital had been abandoned multiple times. And yet within a decade, court historians began again. They retrieved what copies they could. In many cases, archivists had smuggled out only fragments. Where pages were missing, they reconstructed them through cross-referencing ministerial records, private letters, and older court diaries. There are stories of scribes painstakingly matching calligraphy styles to ensure authenticity, of whole village schools being repurposed into temporary archives. This work was tedious, painstaking, monotonous. But it mattered. In Confucian political theory, legitimacy flows from tradition. A ruler without historical continuity is a usurper. Thus, restoring records was not just about memory, it was about the survival of the monarchy itself. Even in the face of societal collapse, the urge to preserve the boring parts, the rituals, the grain taxes, the marriage laws persisted. These were the glue that held Joseon together. The faction wars, when memory became a weapon. But not all who wrote history were neutral. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Joseon was riddled with factional conflict. The two main political groups, the Westerners, Seon, and the Southerners, Naman, fought not only for royal favor, but for the control of the official historical narrative. To understand how powerful the Silak was, consider this. When a king died, a separate team of historians compiled a record of his reign. These annals, once sealed, were never to be edited again. They became permanent, sacred. But here's the twist: who got to write the draft version was often a political decision. A king's allies might emphasize his virtues, while his enemies might highlight failures, missed rituals, or improper appointments. One infamous case was the reign of King Yeonjo, R 1724-1776, a king deeply concerned with balancing factions. He commissioned multiple versions of royal records and reviewed editorial decisions himself, technically a violation of the tradition that kings should never see the historical drafts. But Yeonjo believed, perhaps correctly, that memory could be manipulated unless actively overseen. In essence, the Silak was simultaneously revered as an untouchable text and quietly shaped by the biases of those who compiled it. So what happens when memory, too, becomes contested? And what does that say about the objective value of historical preservation? The rise of the Jujingak, royal libraries, and intellectual politics. In 1776, a new king, Jeongjo, ascended the throne. He was a scholar king, young, energetic, but politically vulnerable. His father, Crown Prince Sado, had been executed by Jeongjo's grandfather under suspicious circumstances. Jeongjo needed allies. He also needed to control the narrative of his lineage. To do this, he built the Jujingak, a royal library on the grounds of Changdeok Palace. It was more than a building, it was a political statement. In the Jujingak, Jeongjo gathered loyal scholars, many from obscure provinces, and gave them unprecedented access to royal documents, books, and state secrets. This was not simply about knowledge. It was about centralizing intellectual power under the throne, away from entrenched bureaucratic factions. The scholars of Jujingak were expected to edit and preserve the Silok and Uigui with integrity, compose royal edicts and policy proposals, study foreign documents, including those from Qing China and the West, translate Buddhist and medical texts into Korean vernacular. The pace was grueling. Scholars sometimes worked 14-hour days, but Jeonjo believed that knowledge, properly managed, could protect the dynasty from corruption and decline. In many ways, this was Joseon's enlightenment moment, and it was built on a foundation of encyclopedic preservation. The ordinary things they recorded. What did these records actually contain? Not grand battles or stirring speeches, but the minutiae of state. How to construct a watermill in a southern province during a drought year. The proper width of silk sashes worn by minor nobles. The dietary restrictions of court eunuchs before major festivals. The colors permitted in mourning clothes for the daughter of a deceased fourth-rank minister. The tide levels observed during a royal barge trip. Why record such things? Because bureaucracy, not charisma, sustained the Joseon state. These details were the gears of governance. A misfiled land deed could cause revolt. A missed festival date could offend heaven. An improper mourning outfit could invite political scandal. So everything was written down. Painstaking, repetitive, boring. But vital. Crisis, survival, and the knowledge that endured. Throughout the 19th century, Joseon faced existential threats. Rising peasant revolts, Western incursions, Qing domination, and later, Japanese colonization. And yet the libraries and archives survived. Not all intact. Of course, many records were looted, burned, or scattered. But the very redundancy of the system, the multiple mountain archives, the copies, the summaries ensured survival. In the early 20th century, as Korea fell under Japanese rule, scholars and monks alike hid portions of the Uigui and Silok. Some ended up in Paris, others in private collections, waiting to return. And through it all, the encyclopedic mindset persisted, to preserve, to copy, to endure. Which raises the question, when a people are denied sovereignty, can memory itself become an act of resistance? You run your hand along the spines of books no one reads. The room is still. Light filters through oiled paper windows. A page falls open not to a battle, but to a list of funeral procession positions from the year 1795. You think, someone wrote this down so it wouldn't be forgotten. But who remembers the person who remembered? This final section explores how Korea's historical encyclopedias shaped not only the Joseon dynasty, but also the nation that followed. We'll examine how this quiet legacy endured colonization, war, and modernization, and what it means to guard memory in an age that forgets so easily. The work of scribes was never glorious, yet in a strange way it outlasted kings. From script to nationhood, the role of records in national identity. The Joseon dynasty came to an official end in 1897, giving way to the short-lived Korean Empire. But by this time, the machinery of record-keeping had been operating continuously for over 500 years. With the rise of modern nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these records, once dusty tools of governance, became something more profound. Artifacts of national identity. Think of the Joseon Wangzhou Silok. It was never meant for the public. Its classical Chinese prose was inaccessible to most Koreans. Yet after the fall of the monarchy and amid Japanese colonial rule, 1910–1945, it became a symbol of what Korea had been, a continuous state with a documented history. Korean intellectuals under colonial occupation began to revisit these archives. Scholars like Jeong In-bo and Cho Nam-seon sought to reinterpret the records not as royal property, but as national property. This was revolutionary. The same boring records that once dictated how many steps a courtier must take at a funeral were now evidence of Korea's historical legitimacy proof against colonial narratives that claimed Korea had no real culture or governance. The Silak was no longer just a reference, it was resistance. Lost loot in the long road home. Despite its power as a cultural symbol, much of Joseon's documentary heritage was at risk of disappearing altogether in the 20th century. When Japan annexed Korea, it began systematically extracting historical materials either to display in Tokyo or to suppress the local sense of history. The Uegui, in particular, was removed from the royal library and taken to Japan after the annexation. These volumes contain the detailed protocols for royal rituals, weddings, ceremonies, and constructions. Their removal was not just theft, it was an erasure of institutional memory. It wasn't until 2011, after decades of negotiation, that South Korea secured the return of 1,200 volumes of the Uegui from Japan. The return was symbolic, but also practical. With them came a fuller understanding of Joseon's inner workings, not just ideology, but the operational logic of a Confucian state. Elsewhere, other records copies of the Silak or Forgotten Land registers were discovered in private collections, dusty monasteries, and international archives. Each new find filled a small gap in the puzzle of Korean history. But even the best preserved record is useless without someone to read it. The translators, making the dead speak. Much of Joseon's encyclopedic tradition was written in classical Chinese, a language of scholarship shared across East Asia. But by the 20th century, most Koreans could no longer read it fluently. Enter the translators. In the 1970s and 1980s, massive state-supported translation projects began. Hundreds of scholars painstakingly rendered the Silak and Uegui into modern Korean. This wasn't a simple process. Translators had to decipher obscure classical idioms, cross-reference names, titles, and places, verify dates across multiple calendars, clarify bureaucratic language long out of use. Some sentences required days of debate. Was a term referring to a ceremonial color or a bureaucratic rank? Did a phrase mean to be punished or to be honored? In many ways, these translators were modern-day scribes still caught in the same endless loop of reading, comparing, revising. Their work made the records available to students, journalists, and ordinary citizens for the first time in history. And yet the language remained slow, the stories methodical, the tone still soothingly dull. That's the beauty of it. Digital memory, from scroll to server. Today, much of Joseon's encyclopedic knowledge lives online. South Korea's National Institute of Korean History has digitized the Joseon Wangjo Silak and made it publicly searchable in both classical Chinese and Korean. Full digital facsimiles of the original scrolls are available. Advanced tools allow users to compare different reigns, track terminology, and search for themes. The Uegui, too, has been digitized by the Kyujingak Institute at Seoul National University, complete with interactive diagrams of rituals and processions. These resources are not just for scholars. Students preparing for history exams, writers of historical dramas, and even everyday citizens now browse archives once reserved for royalty and bureaucrats. But there's something curious about digital archives. They are accessible but also ethereal. We can search faster but read less. The work of the scribe, the slow, deliberate effort to preserve, to reflect, can be lost in the speed of search bars and filtered results. What do we lose when memory becomes frictionless? The invisible lives behind the pages. In all this talk of records and archives, it's easy to forget the people who made them. The scribes who labored in cold rooms with tired hands. The copyists who burned through candlelight to finish transcriptions. the lower-ranking clerks whose names were never recorded. They did not write for glory. They did not write to be read. They wrote because the state demanded it and because they believed that knowledge, no matter how tedious, must survive. Some were punished for errors. Others died in obscurity. Their legacy is not in monuments or folklore, but in the preserved stability of a kingdom that, despite centuries of turmoil, kept running. Imagine this. A minor official in the 18th century notes the number of bricks used in a palace wall. 300 years later, that note helps restorers rebuild the palace after war. That is the power of boring history. Why boring history matters. In the end, the Joseon encyclopedic tradition is not about entertainment. It is about attention to detail, to continuity, to the rituals that form the glue of society. These were not thrillers or epics. They were instruction manuals for a civilization. Their dullness was their strength. By refusing to forget, they refused to disappear. And perhaps, in an age of algorithmic distraction and shallow timelines, we need this spirit more than ever. Because sometimes, what matters most is not what dazzles but what endures. Would a new kingdom today undertake such a project? Would we spend decades documenting the exact thread count of royal robes or the precise etiquette of funeral banquets? Would we care enough to preserve the ordinary? Or would we let it fade because it's too quiet to trend? Story 2. Measuring the sky, how court astronomers map the stars. You stand atop a stone platform, eyes fixed skyward. The wind is sharp, but you do not flinch. You're tracking a flicker of light, a star, a shadow, a planet, perhaps its trajectory barely visible in the quiet dark of early dawn. It's the 15th century, and you're not a mystic or a priest. You're an astronomer, a government official, and your job is to measure the heavens for the good of the state. This is the story of Korea's royal astronomers, officials of the Joseon dynasty, whose painstaking observations weren't just for science or curiosity, but for survival, order, and the divine legitimacy of the monarchy. They didn't name galaxies or debate theoretical physics. They measured solstices, predicted eclipses, and ensured the court's calendar ran like clockwork. Because in Joseon, time itself was a matter of state. The role of astronomy in Joseon society. To understand the gravity of astronomy in the Joseon dynasty, we must begin with Confucian cosmology. Heaven Qin was the supreme order, the source of natural law. The king was the son of heaven, ruling not by personal charisma but by alignment with cosmic rhythms. If heaven and earth were in harmony, the kingdom would prosper. If not, floods, revolts, famine, or worse. Thus, tracking the movement of the heavens wasn't optional, it was essential. In this way, astronomy wasn't about understanding the universe. It was about maintaining political legitimacy. If the royal calendar fell out of sync with the seasons, if a festival came before the solstice, or an eclipse was not predicted, it meant the king had lost heaven's favor. The court needed to know when to plant, when to mourn, when to marry. So the astronomers worked quietly, rigorously, and often invisibly. The Royal Bureau of Astronomy, a silent power. Known as the Gwansangam, called Gwinsangkum, Enus. Literally, the Bureau for Observing the Heavens, this government institution was founded in the early Joseon period, though its roots stretch back to earlier dynasties. The Gwansangam was responsible for maintaining the lunar-solar calendar, predicting eclipses and planetary movements, recording celestial events, comets, novas, sunspots, calculating seasonal changes and solstices, issuing daily astrological advice for the royal court. The officials were often chosen from the Chungin, middle people, class not quite aristocrats, not quite commoners. Many came from hereditary lines of specialists' families who had served in the bureau for generations. Their training was exacting. They had to master mathematics, classical Chinese, observational instruments, and foreign calendrical systems from Ming and later Qing China. Unlike scholars who passed the civil service exams, Guagio, through essay writing and poetry, court astronomers had to calculate a less respected but utterly vital task. They were engineers of time, the instruments of observation. Imagine the tools of a Joseon astronomer. No telescopes, no computers, just precision-made instruments, many inspired by Chinese models and improved by Korean ingenuity. One Ganwadi armillary sphere. Used to model celestial movement, this bronze structure was a lattice of rings representing the celestial equator, ecliptic, and meridian. A trained astronomer could manipulate the rings to simulate the sun's path or predict the position of a planet. Tu Hanseng celestial globe. A static globe with star positions fixed onto it. Korea's version featured both Chinese and indigenous constellations, adjusted for local latitude. 3 Jeomyeonggilgu hemisphere sundial. A bowl-shaped sundial used to tell the time by the sun's shadow. It was placed in public spaces so citizens could align daily life with official court time. 4 Hanchinui astronomical clock. Commissioned under King Sejong's reign, this intricate water-powered clock combined timekeeping with celestial motion, showing hours, days, and the position of heavenly bodies. It was one of the most advanced mechanical devices of its time. These instruments were kept in observatories near the capital, such as the Cheomseongdi in Jeonju, arguably the oldest surviving astronomical observatory in East Asia. Though older than Joseon, it remained a symbol of Korea's long astronomical tradition. The Gwansangam's tools were not for private research. They were for precise, bureaucratic observation. Stars were not dreams, they were data. Time as a bureaucratic tool. The calendar was the most important product of court astronomy. Based on a lunisolar system, it required constant adjustment. The moon's cycles defined months. The sun's path defined the seasons. Intercalary, leap, months were added every few years to prevent seasonal drift. These adjustments weren't theoretical, they had real consequences. If farmers planted too early due to a calendar error, crops would fail. If mourning rituals fell on the wrong days, it was a spiritual offense. If court festivals mismatched solstices, it was a sign of disorder in the realm. Thus, the calendar had to be correct. Every December, astronomers submitted a draft of the next year's calendar to the king. After review and approval, it was carved into woodblocks for printing and distribution across the kingdom. And when eclipses were predicted, they had to be exact, not just the date, but the hour, even the minute. Miss it, and the court faced ridicule or suspicion. One missed eclipse in the 18th century led to multiple dismissals in the Gwansangam. That's how serious it was. Eclipses, comets, and celestial warnings. In Joseon cosmology, unusual celestial phenomena were not curiosities. They were omens. Eclipses signified disruption in heaven's will. Comets could forewarn rebellion or famine. Red clouds or unusual star groupings were signs to perform court rituals of appeasement. Astronomers were thus also risk managers. Their job was to observe and advise, not to interpret. That was for the king and his ministers, but their warnings carried weight. In one documented case, astronomers noted a nova, a new star appearing in the northern sky. The court debated what action to take. Ministers argued it was a sign to reform tax policy. The king used it to justify a purge of corrupt officials. One celestial blip, major terrestrial consequences. What power, then, lay in a quiet observation? Imported knowledge and local innovation. While Joseon maintained a strong Confucian ideology, it did not isolate itself from outside learning. Court astronomers studied Chinese astronomical texts, especially those of the Ming dynasty. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, they also began to study Jesuit star charts and calendars introduced via China. These Western models offered more precise planetary predictions based on heliocentric systems. This presented a dilemma. Should a Confucian court adopt foreign tools based on a worldview that contradicted its own? The answer, as it often is in bureaucracies, was practical: yes, as long as it works. Thus, while publicly maintaining traditional cosmology, Joseon astronomers quietly updated calculations using Jesuit data. They did not debate Copernican theory in the palace. They used it to fix the timing of rice festivals. In a sense, this was the essence of their work: accuracy without attention, progress without spectacle. The invisible legacy of astronomers. Few of these astronomers are remembered by name. They left behind no dramatic treatises, no manifestos. But their records survive. The Seunjiangwen Ilgi, the daily records of the Royal Secretariat, includes thousands of notes from the Gwansangam: partial lunar eclipse predicted for the 7th hour, solar zenith angle observed at midday, winter solstice verified. No embellishment, just quiet certainty. And yet without them the kingdom could not run, the farmer couldn't plant, the priest couldn't bless, the king couldn't govern. Astronomers didn't guide armies, they guided time. But what happens when a society no longer needs the stars to govern its affairs? The stars wheel above you in slow procession, indifferent to politics, famine, or kings. Yet on Earth specifically, in the royal court of Joseon, Korea, every glimmer and shadow in that sky is tallied, timed, and turned into order. We look deeper into the machinery of time, how astronomers translated the chaos of the sky into predictable patterns, why their calculations mattered to everyday people, and how the bureaucratic culture of Joseon transformed celestial events into state protocol. The stars don't change for us, but we have always changed because of them. The king's clock, Sejong's astronomical revolution. No ruler shaped Joseon astronomy more than King Sejong the Great, r. 1418–1450. Known for inventing Hangul, Korea's alphabet, he was also obsessed with standardizing time and measurement because without them, a state cannot govern. Under Sejong's reign, the Gwansangam was transformed from a passive recording office into an innovative scientific institution. The astronomers were ordered to recalculate Korea's latitude to correct calendar drift, adjust the Chinese-based calendar system to fit Korean seasonal conditions, develop astronomical devices that anyone in the capital could use to tell time. Their mission was to make time visible. Sejong commissioned Jang Yong-sil, a low-born but brilliant engineer, to construct a new generation of astronomical tools. Jang built Angbulgu, bowl-shaped sundials placed in public squares. Jajeongnu, a self-striking water clock that marked hours with bells and dolls. Hanchanui, an armillary sphere powered by flowing water, showing planetary movement. These instruments were more than scientific marvels, they were tools of transparency. By placing sundials in the streets, Sejong let commoners align their lives with the court. It was a radical idea, democratizing time. A farmer could now sow his fields knowing when the solstice was. A merchant could prepare for a tax audit knowing when the month would end. A village could begin rituals on the correct day without waiting for a royal decree. And the stars guided it all. Celestial calculations and the lunisolar dance. Korea's calendar was lunisolar based on both the cycles of the moon and the sun. Maintaining it was a nightmare of complexity, requiring constant recalibration. Lunar aspects. A month began with the new moon. Each moon cycle was ~29, 5 days. 12 lunar months totaled ~354 days. Solar corrections. The solar year was ~365, 25 days. This meant the lunar calendar was days short each year. To keep festivals in sync with seasons, Astronomers inserted a leap month every 2-3 years. Predicting when to insert that extra month was the job of the Gwansangam. If they got it wrong, a major holiday, say, the Dano Festival early summer, might end up in late spring, confusing harvests and violating Confucian expectations of seasonal rites. Thus, astronomers calculated the solar terms geolgi, 24 precise moments dividing the solar year, like Jeonchip, awakening of insects, or Dongji, winter solstice. These were marked on the calendar and matched with lunar dates to determine whether an intercalary month was needed. Each year's calculations were compiled in the Siakbo, a manuscript of astronomical tables, predictions, and planetary positions. Every decimal mattered. The wrong number could mean the wrong planting date, the wrong royal rite, or the wrong omen. Time for the people, standardization as stability. In modern life, we barely notice standardized time. But in Joseon, introducing consistent timekeeping was a massive cultural and bureaucratic undertaking. Different regions had once used slightly different local time, based on sunrise and sunset. Festivals were timed by oral tradition, the moon's appearance, or even weather signs. King Sejong's astronomical reforms were designed to override that localism. Centralized time meant centralized power. Consider the Jajeonu water clock installed in the palace. It had 4 jars, each calibrated to drip at a constant rate. Every hour, the water level triggered a float mechanism. This activated wooden figures that struck gongs or drums. The sound signaled the passage of time audible across palace courtyards. Nearby officials could synchronize court sessions, royal meals, and inspections. Outside the palace, runners relayed time signals to distant provinces. Eventually, regional offices were issued sundials and clocks to match the capital's rhythm. Time, like rice or silk, became a managed commodity. When the sky failed to cooperate, despite all the instruments and calculations, nature sometimes refused to play along. Cloud cover could obscure eclipses, atmospheric distortion could make stars appear to shift, and the lunisolar calendar, despite its complexity, could never be fully precise. Some months had 30 days, others 29. A miscalculation could throw off everything. There are records of astronomers staying up for nights in freezing towers, trying to confirm an eclipse predicted months earlier. If the eclipse came late or early, it was considered a political and moral failure. One eclipse in 1583 was predicted to last 2 hours, but lasted less than 1. The chief astronomer was demoted for poor astrological stewardship. Another time, a miscalculation of a solstice date led to court rituals being performed a day early. Ministers argued over whether this constituted a violation of heaven's rights. These mistakes were not tolerated as scientific error. They were seen as cosmic insult. And yet astronomers kept watching, adjusting, learning. Astrology and ritual, the calendar of morality. While Joseon astronomy was scientific in many ways, it was also deeply moral. Each day in the calendar came with unlucky and lucky designations rooted in Chinese astrological systems like the 10 celestial stems and 12 earthly branches. These influenced which days were suitable for funerals, when royal marriages could be arranged, when to open new roads or bury ancestors. Astronomers compiled daily almanacs, tangsa or jeongryok, listing auspicious and inauspicious activities. You might be advised: avoid long travel, good for harvesting roots, do not begin construction. Even the king obeyed. In fact, one of the few public-facing roles of court astronomers was to present the almanac to the monarch each month, often during the Sejogian morning court assembly. These moments, though quiet, were highly symbolic. They reminded the court that all power, ritual, military, political, rested on alignment with the stars. The astronomers did not command armies, but their numbers told generals when to march. Knowledge under pressure, politics in the sky. The Gwansangam was not immune to politics. Factions sometimes accused rival astronomers of misreading the sky to benefit political agendas. A prediction of turbulent celestial winds could be interpreted as a sign to purge a rival clan. Under King Yeonjo, R 1724-1776, astronomy became a battleground of reform versus tradition. Some scholars argued for adopting the Gregorian calendar used by Western missionaries, citing its superior accuracy. Others feared that abandoning the old system would disrupt Confucian cosmology and threaten royal legitimacy. The king ultimately allowed quiet integration of Western data but kept the old system in public use. It was a compromise, better predictions, same worldview. Truth bowed gently to ideology. A kingdom aligned to the cosmos. By the 19th century, Joseon's astronomical tradition began to decline. New technologies from Japan and the West brought mechanical clocks, printed calendars, and European star charts. The Gwansangam shrank in importance. But the mindset, the belief that the heavens must be measured, consulted, and obeyed remained embedded in the culture. Every ritual still began with a date from the almanac. Every new year still opened with a review of eclipses and solstices. Every commoner still checked which days were safe to marry, harvest, or travel. And behind it all still were the silent observers, the court astronomers, measuring the sky in ink and silence. But in a world moving toward modern science and political upheaval, how long could this fusion of bureaucracy and stargazing endure? The stars remained the same, but the kingdom below them did not. As the 19th century rolled toward its chaotic end, the disciplined gaze of the Joseon court astronomers began to falter. Their charts, once the backbone of state order, now seemed less relevant. Western clocks ticked differently. Foreign ships came with calendars of their own. A silent clockwork revolution was underway, one not just of machinery, but of meaning. We witnessed the slow unraveling of Korea's traditional astronomical systems under the weight of modernization, colonization, and shifting ideologies. But we also explore what endured quietly, persistently long after the observatories closed. The first disruptions, Western time arrives. Throughout the 18th century, Joseon astronomers had quietly integrated mathematical insights from the Jesuits via China. These included more precise models of planetary orbits and more accurate solar-lunar calculations. But the worldview remained Confucian: Earth at the center, heaven as the moral compass. Then, in the 19th century, Western mechanical clocks began arriving in ports like Busan and Incheon. At first, these devices were novelties, gifts from foreign envoys, curiosities in noble houses. But they kept better time. They ran even on cloudy days. They didn't require sky watching. And most dangerously, they told time in equal hours, the same length at noon and midnight, summer and winter. This clashed with the traditional temporal hours used in Joseon, 12 unequal divisions of the day and night, which varied by season. In summer, an hour could be 75 modern minutes. In winter, it might be 45. Western time was universal, mechanical, and secular. It did not care about heaven. It did not wait for ritual. And in time, neither did the bureaucracy. The Gwansangam's final days. By the late 1800s, the Gwansangam, once a critical organ of the state, had become more ceremonial than functional. With the growing influence of Japan, especially after the 1876 Treaty of Ganghwa, Korea was being pushed into adopting international norms, including standardized calendars. In 1895, under pressure from Japanese advisors and reformist Korean officials, the solar Gregorian calendar was formally adopted in place of the lunar solar system. This was more than a clerical change. It marked the end of an entire cosmological order. Royal rituals no longer followed astrologically chosen dates. Farmers planted according to new printed almanacs imported from Tokyo. Court astronomers became archivists, not observers. The Gwansingam was quietly dissolved. Its instruments were moved to museums, its records stored, forgotten, or lost. What had once been the eye of the state turned blind not by failure, but by irrelevance. The loss of calendar as culture. The new calendar system was efficient but impersonal. Days became numbers. Months lost their poetry. In the lunisolar calendar, dates were named things like Chilseok, night of the weaver girl; Ipchun, beginning of spring; Bikno, white dew; Dongji, winter solstice. Each came with its own foods, customs, rituals, and proverbs. A year was not just a time unit, it was a cultural ecosystem. With the Gregorian calendar came January and February, weekends and workweeks. Predictable, consistent, and empty of mythology. For urban Koreans, this was modernity. For rural communities, it was alienation. Entire ways of knowing the world's seasonal rhythms, folk rituals, planting days, ancestral anniversaries began to fade. The stars still turned, but fewer people looked up. Astronomy under empire. When Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910, it brought with it a drive to replace local knowledge systems with centralized imperial science. The focus shifted from astronomy to surveying, mapping land, not stars. Japanese scientists measured Korea's terrain with modern instruments, enforcing a national grid system. Observatory domes were built not for traditional sky watching, but for Western-style astrophysics. These centers answered to Tokyo, not Seoul. The Joseon-era instruments, if preserved, became museum pieces. The scholars who had once forecasted eclipses became unemployed or absorbed into colonial bureaucracies as low-ranking clerks. Traditional almanacs were banned in many areas, deemed superstitious. Ritual dates were standardized. Public sundials were dismantled. And yet private households still marked the lunar calendar. Villagers still consulted fortune-tellers for planting dates. Old calendars were copied by hand, passed in secret, tucked into Bibles and Buddhist sutras alike. Astronomy had gone underground. Rediscovery and recovery. After Korea's liberation in 1945 and the subsequent Korean War, the nation focused on rebuilding and industrialization. Modern science was promoted, but largely in the Western mold. Then, in the 1970s and 80s, a quiet cultural shift began. Scholars and curators started re-examining Joseon's scientific legacy, including its forgotten astronomers. They unearthed records of precise eclipse predictions centuries ahead of Europe. Water clocks with mechanical sophistication, rivaling early European models. A deep integration of science, governance, and social order. The Cheomseongdi Observatory in Jeonju was restored. Replicas of Jajeonu clocks were installed in public plazas. Children were taught about King Sejong not just as the creator of Hangul, but as a champion of astronomical reform. Astronomy returned not as bureaucratic necessity, but as heritage. The sky today, what survives? Modern South Korea now operates with atomic clocks, GPS satellites, and space telescopes. But echoes of the Joseon system remain. Seollal, the Lunar New Year, is still a major national holiday timed by the moon. Daily horoscopes based on the ecliptic branches still influence wedding dates and travel plans. Farmers' almanacs, Nangsa, based on seasonal solar terms, are printed every year. The 24 solar terms were inscribed by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2016. Even the tradition of observing eclipses remains. In 2023, tens of thousands of Koreans gathered to watch a partial solar eclipse, eyes turned skyward, just as their ancestors did 5 centuries ago. Not because it affected tax policy or royal ceremonies, but because it reminded them of their place in something vast. Reflection, the bureaucracy of the heavens. Joseon astronomy may seem distant now, calendars etched in bamboo, clocks dripping water, eclipses tied to ministerial appointments. But beneath its ritual and rigidity lay a profound human instinct to make meaning of the sky. The court astronomers of Joseon weren't revolutionaries or stargazers. They were functionaries, measuring the heavens not for awe but for order. And yet their work tells us something enduring, that civilizations are built not just on soil and stone, but on shared time. That governance begins with when, not just how. Their legacy is not in telescopes or satellites, but in the quiet ticking of tradition. In the idea that the stars can still guide us not through fate, but through attention. Story 3. The Unseen Builders, Korea's Forgotten Bridge Engineers. You cross a stream on a slab of stone. The water gurgles beneath your feet, clear and indifferent. The bridge doesn't creak. It doesn't shake. It doesn't even announce itself. It simply is a path between banks placed there by hands long gone. This is the story of Korea's forgotten bridge builders. Not the architects of palaces or fortresses, but the civil engineers of the Joseon dynasty who built infrastructure in the service of routine life, travel, trade, and bureaucracy. Their names are mostly lost. Their bridges were rarely celebrated in poetry, but their work made the kingdom run. We explore the origins of bridge building in Joseon, Korea, how geography and Confucian ideals shaped infrastructure, and why the most important construction projects were often the least adorned. Why bridges mattered in a Confucian state. In the Joseon worldview, roads and bridges were not symbols of imperial majesty, they were moral obligations. The state, modeled on Confucian hierarchy, had a duty to ensure the smooth flow of life. Messages to the provinces, tax rice to the capital, scholars to the civil service exams, and farmers to market towns. Without bridges, society halted. But there was more than function. In Confucian thought, a ruler who allowed bridges to decay was seen as neglecting the men, the people. And to neglect the people was to risk losing the mandate of heaven. Thus, from the earliest days of the dynasty, kings were advised to build and maintain bridges not as monuments, but as signs of righteousness. One 15th century memorial submitted to the court read, "A bridge in the southern province has collapsed. The people wade through water, falling ill. It is the duty of heaven's son to ensure their safe crossing." The king approved emergency funds. A small, flat stone bridge was rebuilt. It was never named, but for the farmers of that region it was survival. The geography of necessity. Korea's mountainous terrain shaped its infrastructure. Narrow valleys, short rivers, and steep inclines made long, flat roads rare. Most travel followed natural contours, streams, ridges, and old trails. Bridges were built not for grandeur, but because there was no other way across. There were 3 main types. Dalgyo Kodokyo, inu /stone slab bridges. The most common form. Flat stones placed across short streams or ditches. No handrails, no ornament. Found in villages, fields, and farm paths. Hyongyo Kohyenkyo, inu /arch bridges. Masonry or wood arching over deeper water. Sometimes with stone piers and parapets. Used in towns or near administrative centers. Janggyo Kochunkyo, inu long causeway bridges. Series of flat stones on piers over wide, shallow floodplains. Seen near river deltas and major routes. Built to withstand seasonal flooding. But no matter the design, the ideal was always function first. Joseon aesthetics valued simplicity and restraint. A bridge that performed quietly was better than one that drew attention. This principle, subtlety over spectacle, ran through the entire infrastructure of the state. building materials, and local expertise. Bridge builders relied on local stone, local wood, and crucially local knowledge. The central government rarely dispatched elite architects for rural bridges. Instead, they issued construction orders to county magistrates, who in turn enlisted local artisans, stonemasons, and laborers. This decentralized system created regional variations in bridge style. In the rocky north, slabs of granite were common. In the flatter southern regions, bridges used stacked stone piers and wooden decking. In the swampy west, bridges might be built on fill or raised timber causeways. The builders worked without blueprints in the modern sense. They relied on measuring ropes, plumb bobs, and geometric ratios preserved in oral tradition or local manuals. A master stonemason might pass down knowledge through apprenticeships, not formal schooling. These were engineers without names, known only by the durability of their work. The labor behind the stones. Constructing even a simple bridge required a small army of workers. Stone haulers, dragging slabs from quarries by sled. Earth movers, shaping the banks and foundation. Masons, fitting each stone by hand without mortar. Overseers, ensuring the incline, span, and drainage matched expectations. In flood-prone regions, builders raised the bridge base using layered gravel and sand, learning to calculate for erosion by observation alone. The slope was always away from the riverbanks to prevent water pooling. Bridge building was often seasonal. Dry winter months were preferred, when rivers receded and workers were free from farming. And while some major projects involved corvée labor, forced service, many village bridges were built voluntarily as acts of communal responsibility. Inscriptions on some ancient slabs read simply, "Erected by the people of Yangchuan." It was civic engineering as quiet virtue. Bridges and bureaucracy. Bridges were also tools of the state. Every government courier route called ochre was mapped, measured, and inspected. These roads connected the capital with provincial prefectures and border outposts. They carried not only officials, but also royal edicts, tax records, and examination results. Bridges along these routes had to meet certain standards. Wide enough for ox carts. Strong enough for full loads of grain or iron. Maintained regularly by local offices. Each year, infrastructure reports were sent to Seoul. Magistrates documented bridge conditions, erosion, stone loss, timber decay. If a bridge collapsed and caused delay or injury, officials could face demotion. Yet despite this oversight, very few bridges were ever formally named. This anonymity reflects a deeper cultural truth. Bridges weren't monuments, they were tools. Whether, water, and where. The biggest enemy of a Joseon bridge was not war, it was weather. Monsoon rains turned trickling creeks into raging rivers. Winter frost cracked stone. Spring floods undermined footings. And with every disaster came the need for quiet, diligent repair. Some bridges were rebuilt multiple times over centuries. A slab bridge might be replaced with an arched span. A timber span might become stone, but the function remained. There is a story from the annals of the Joseon dynasty, the Silak, about a bridge in Jeolla province. It had been destroyed by flood 3 times. Each time, the magistrate of the region requested funds. Each time, the court replied, "Build again, but build wisely." Eventually, local artisans adjusted the span, added flood drains, and rebuilt the piers at a new angle. The bridge lasted 200 years. Not because of royal vision, but because of trial, error, and quiet ingenuity. A bridge as a boundary. In Confucian Korea, geography was also moral. Bridges often marked the edge of jurisdiction. One province ended on the north bank, another began on the south. Tax authority changed. Dialects shifted. The bridge was the threshold between systems. Some bridges even became ritual sites. Farewell bridges, Ibiangyo, where officials departing for far provinces said goodbye to family. Ceremonial bridges crossed during royal processions or religious pilgrimages. Shrine-adjacent bridges, used by monks traveling between temples. And still these bridges bore no names, no plaques, no commemorations, just stones across water. How many lives passed over them without notice? In this quiet, functional world of civil engineering, the bridge was not an event, it was a condition. It was not to be admired, but relied upon. But what happens when these stone bridges, built for hooves and bare feet, meet the demands of trucks and asphalt? When the values of permanence and simplicity are replaced by speed and scale? You walk the dirt road eastward, passing rice paddies, irrigation canals, and low stone walls. Before you stretches a bridge, 3 flat granite slabs resting on 2 worn piers. There is no railing, no name, no marker, and yet this bridge is older than the road itself. It was here when your grandfather crossed it and his before him. It links not just banks but time. We explore how bridges shape the connective tissue of Joseon Korea, not as monuments, but as the silent infrastructure of governance, taxation, mobility, and even social structure. If a state is a body, then these humble stone crossings were its nerves, quiet, durable, and essential. The road and the bridge, twin pillars of bureaucracy. The ochre system, the government-maintained postal and transportation routes, was the backbone of Joseon administration. It enabled couriers to deliver royal edicts to provinces within days, officials to rotate between posts on schedule, tax shipments of grain and tribute goods to move seasonally. But all of this relied on bridges, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them between the capital and distant provinces. Each major route, e.g., the Jeonbu Road from Hanyang Seoul to Busan, had designated bridge checklists. Magistrates were responsible for maintenance, and failure to repair a bridge that hindered royal business could lead to disciplinary action. Even temporary log bridges or stone step crossings were considered critical. The goal was not luxury, but unbroken passage. And yet, the most detailed records often read like this. Stone bridge at Jangpyeong inspected, 3rd pier damaged by thaw, slabs reset, water channel cleared, cost 800 yang. No grand opening, no names of laborers, just updates like a to-do list for a kingdom. Taxes on the move, bridges and the flow of grain. One of the most vital uses of bridges in Joseon was to enable the transport of tax grain, Joseonmi. Since taxes were often paid in kind, especially rice, barley, and beans, entire roads were built to accommodate grain convoys from rural storehouses to central warehouses and harbors. These convoys used ox carts and pack horses, and each bridge had to be strong enough to bear the weight of grain barrels, wide enough for carts and runners, passable during monsoon seasons with flood relief spillways. Bridges thus became choke points. If one failed, tax shipments stalled. Officials in charge of tax grain, hajang and sacho, would sometimes pay out of pocket to fix bridges quickly rather than await government repairs. In some regions, grain storage pavilions were placed near key bridges both for rest and for emergency rationing. These sites, though utilitarian, formed the nodes of a national economic network. One surviving bridge in Jeollado, dated to the 17th century, bears an inscription, "Built for the rice to pass." That was enough. The exam roads, students on the king's path. Every 3 years, civil service examinations, Guagyo, were held in Hanyang. Aspiring scholars from every province traveled by foot, cart, or boat to reach the capital. Bridges along the exam routes took on quiet prestige. They were known among scholars, if not officially named, and some developed reputations. Lucky Bridge, where students stopped to bathe and reflect. Silence Bridge, where candidates vowed not to speak before the test. Return Bridge, where those who failed wept then turned homeward. One official report notes that in 1743, a group of scholars from Joseon crossed 37 bridges on foot to reach the exam hall. Their journey was timed by moon cycles and local foot calendars, small printed almanacs that mapped routes, river depths, and seasonal rains. These bridges were intellectual arteries, carrying ambition across rivers. Ritual crossings and symbolic significance. While most bridges were practical, a few held ritual importance. 1. Farewell bridges. Used during royal or official departures, these were often the site of final bows and gift exchanges. A crossing marked the threshold between private and public life. In one account, King Sejong reportedly paused at a bridge to compose a verse before departing on a royal inspection. Another story describes a scholar crossing a village bridge before leaving for the capital and leaving behind a sandal as a token. 2. Boundary bridges. Some bridges marked the edge of a province or district, with stone markers engraved with Confucian aphorisms about governance, patience, or diligence. One such bridge near Pyongyang read, "The official who rushes over water forgets the depth." These were reminders, not instructions. 3. Funerary crossings. In certain traditions, funeral processions paused at the bridge before entering burial grounds, as if transitioning between the world of the living and the dead. The symbolism was subtle, nothing was built to impress, but the act of crossing remained sacred. The invisible builders, artisans without attribution. Although architects of palaces were often recorded in annals, the bridge builders, stonemasons, engineers, foremen were largely anonymous. Occasionally, inscriptions survive, etched into stone slabs. Constructed in the year of Im-jin under Magistrate Yun, mason Kim Jeom, laborers 39. But most bridges say nothing. They are silent testimonies to collective effort. Unlike temples or royal pavilions, these structures were built to be used, not admired. And perhaps for that reason, they still endure. Many bridges in Korea today, especially in the countryside, follow the same footprint as their Joseon-era predecessors. Some use the same stones. You may have crossed one without knowing. Disaster and resilience. Bridges, more than any other structure, suffered constant wear. Floods carried away slabs. Ice expanded cracks in piers. Tree roots disrupted stone beds. War repurposed bridge stones for fort walls or barricades. In each case, the state recorded the damage and delegated responsibility. Sometimes, monks rebuilt bridges as acts of merit. Sometimes, villagers raised funds. In 1769, a bridge near Andong collapsed after heavy summer rain. The local Confucian school sent students to clear debris and rebuild under the supervision of the town elder. They left behind no plaque, just a functioning bridge. Their names are not in textbooks, but their work carried generations. Bridges in art and memory. Oddly, bridges rarely appear in Joseon-era paintings or literature. When they do, it is as background, a crossing in a landscape scroll, a mention in a travel diary. Perhaps this is because bridges were never meant to be noticed. They were tools, not metaphors. Their success lay in their invisibility. When a bridge worked, no one stopped to admire it. They just crossed. And yet, in one rare poem from the 18th century, a scholar writes, "The bridge does not ask your name, nor how heavy your feet. It only waits in water's path for those who must pass." These are the bridges of Joseon, quiet, functional, and enduring. No arches of marble, no grand inaugurations, just slabs over water built by hands that understood what permanence meant. But what happens to such structures when modernity arrives with steel and concrete? When roads widen, rivers are dammed, and traffic demands speed over stillness. You walk a modern road now 4 lanes wide, paved, lined with steel guardrails. Cars buzz past in a blur. But just off to the side, down a slope and half swallowed by weeds, there's a line of stone slabs stretching across a shallow stream. The old bridge is still there. Forgotten, perhaps, but not gone. This final section explores the legacy of Joseon's anonymous bridge builders. We look at how modernization changed Korea's landscape, how some of these bridges were lost while others were saved, and what it means to preserve such quiet infrastructure in an age of speed and spectacle. Because sometimes, the past doesn't vanish, it simply steps aside. The arrival of modern infrastructure. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Korea began to shift from a pre-industrial society to one increasingly shaped by imported engineering and modern materials. Under Japanese colonial rule 1910–1945, infrastructure became a tool of control as much as progress. Roads were widened for troop movements and resource extraction. Railroads cut across ancient footpaths. Rivers were redirected. And old bridges, flat, humble, in the way, were deemed obsolete. Stone slab bridges were dismantled for building material, buried under new embankments, bypassed by steel trusses and concrete causeways. No formal registry existed for most of them. Their destruction was not noted because their creation had not been either. Bridges that had lasted centuries vanished in months. Resistance in stone, what survived? And yet not all was lost. In rural villages, where modernization came slowly, many old bridges remained in use well into the 1960s and 70s. Some were repaired with cement but retained their stone piers, repurposed for foot traffic as larger roads diverted cars, rediscovered during flood control or agricultural development projects. One remarkable example is the Chilcheonggyeo Bridge in Jeonju, which dates back to the early Joseon period. Though long overshadowed by modern crossings, it was rediscovered during a city redevelopment project. Its piers, water channels, and flagstone decking were found largely intact beneath layers of mud and urban buildup. Today it's preserved as a cultural heritage site not because of beauty, but because of durability. Other bridges fared less well. In the 1980s, as Korea rapidly industrialized, whole networks of pre-modern roads were erased. Development prioritized scale and speed, not continuity. Highways now cut through former post routes. Rivers were straightened for efficiency. Bridges were widened, their old cores hidden beneath layers of concrete. But still some stones remain. Reclaiming the past, preservation and rediscovery. Beginning in the 1990s, cultural historians and civil engineers began to document surviving Joseon-era bridges. These surveys revealed bridges still used by farmers and herders, unknown to local officials. Bridges buried beneath roads, rediscovered after heavy rains. Bridges that had been part of Uigwa-documented royal processions, but had vanished from maps. In response, preservation efforts began. Mapping and listing known historic bridges by era, design, and condition. Restoring bridges in conjunction with local communities. Integrating bridges into walking trails, heritage routes, and museum paths. Some bridges once forgotten became stops on cultural pilgrimages. Schoolchildren walked them. Tour guides explained their design, and slowly the invisible became visible again. But preservation is not simple. Many bridges straddle the line between function and artifact. Should they be restored, reinforced, left alone, covered in glass, used or observed? Each choice involves a question. Do we preserve the bridge as a thing or as an idea? The lessons of the builders. There is a quiet philosophy in the work of Joseon's bridge builders, one that feels deeply out of step with our current world. They built without speed. A bridge might take months. There were no project deadlines, only seasonal rhythms. They built without signatures, no plaques, no stone-carved boasts. The builders knew their names would vanish. What mattered was whether the bridge held. They built without spectacle, no arches to photograph, no ceremonies. Their bridges were supposed to disappear into the landscape, not dominate it. This is infrastructure as humility, not hubris. And perhaps that's why these bridges, quiet as they are, continue to speak across centuries. Bridges in modern Korean memory. In today's Korea, infrastructure is sleek, fast, and highly engineered. The country boasts some of the world's longest cable-stayed bridges and most advanced tunnels. Expressways stretch from Seoul to Busan. High-speed trains zip over river crossings. And yet local history projects, community museums, and environmental groups increasingly celebrate old bridges as symbols of sustainability, using local materials and lasting for centuries, as examples of vernacular design adapting to local geography without altering it, as reminders of continuity, the same stones crossed by ancestors and children alike. In some towns, ceremonial crossings have been revived. Festivals include bridge processions, reenacting the passage of scholars or officials, and university programs in civil engineering now include units on traditional Korean construction methods, not just as heritage, but as models of resilient, low-impact design. The bridges are not just relics. They are models of how to build with care, for use for time. Reflection, the crossing that never ends. Every bridge implies a passage. In Joseon, Korea, to build a bridge was not just to connect two banks. It was to connect people to purpose, villages to law, fields to markets, students to dreams. The builders of these bridges knew their names would fade. They did not seek monuments. They sought function, stability, endurance. Their reward was not glory, but the silent trust of countless footsteps. Today, as we pave and repave, as we engineer and automate, there is something deeply grounding in their legacy. It reminds us that the most essential parts of a civilization may be those that do not seek attention only to serve. So the next time you cross a bridge, stone, wood, steel, or concrete, pause for a moment and ask, who built this? And did they know they were making something that would outlast them? Story 4. Silent Scrolls, the bureaucrats who documented a dynasty. The palace is quiet but not still. In a shaded chamber off the main hall, a man bends over his desk. His robes are modest, his posture correct, his hands steady. He writes not poetry or proclamation but a record. What was said, who said it, how it was said, and who witnessed it. This is the story of Joseon's bureaucrats, particularly the scribes, recorders, and archivists who spent their lives not in decision-making, but in documentation. They were the ones who turned fleeting words into permanent scrolls, court debates into annals, and whispers into binding accounts. They were invisible to power, yet indispensable to it. They built no policy, commanded no soldiers, passed no laws. But without their ink, the dynasty would have no memory. Who were the bureaucrats of record? In Joseon, Korea, bureaucracy was not simply administration, it was the mechanism through which Confucian order was made real. Every aspect of governance, from royal edicts to grain shipments, had to be recorded. This role fell to an army of bureaucrats across various ranks and departments. Among them, the most overlooked but arguably most essential were the scribes, jigwin, diarists, and archivists, chajingwin. Some worked in the Seungjeongwen Royal Secretariat, recording the daily life and decisions of the king. Others worked in ministries or local offices, noting tax collections, trials, or construction logs. Still others compiled reports for the central annals or edited them for storage in Jujingak, the royal library. They were not noble by birth. Most came from the Chungin-class middle-status technicians and passed lower-level exams that tested knowledge of law, precedent, and document formatting. Their status was modest, their workload was relentless, their impact lasting. The Seungjeongwen Ilgi, a diary of power. At the very heart of Joseon record-keeping was the Seunjeongwen Ilgi, the daily records of the royal secretariat. Begun in 1623 and continuing for nearly 270 years, it is one of the longest and most detailed historical records in the world. Every day, appointed diarists followed the king recording. Audience schedules, speeches and decrees, court discussions and policy debates, names and ranks of those present, reactions, silences, hesitation. Even a king's tone of voice or moment of pause might be noted. These entries were compiled nightly, reviewed by senior scribes and sealed. Once submitted, they were considered untouchable. The king himself could not edit them. Why such precision? Because the court understood. Memory could be manipulated, but records could prevent that. If the king changed his stance, the Ilgi revealed it. If a minister misrepresented a meeting, the scroll disproved it. Truth in the Joseon bureaucracy was built one inked line at a time. A day in the life of a court recorder. Imagine yourself as a diarist assigned to the Seunjeongwen. It's a chilly morning in early spring. You rise before dawn, dress in simple scholar's robes, and report to the outer court. You don't speak, you don't bow. You sit behind a lattice screen, brush and inkstone ready. The king arrives. Ministers line the hall. Discussions begin about grain prices, a local revolt, a disputed land title. Your job, record everything. You do not interpret. You do not editorialize. You write what is said and what is done, nothing more. Later, you return to the archive. You and two others compare notes, cross-check details, ensure consistency. Your draft is reviewed by a senior secretary who verifies its alignment with official tone and format. The final copy is written on Hanji Korean mulberry paper, prized for its strength and longevity. It is stored, logged, and added to the year's volume. You go home. Tomorrow it begins again. The ethics of silence. The court diarist held an unusual ethical position. They had full access to power but no authority within it. They observed kings in their private moods, saw ministers argue, even heard gossip that could ruin reputations. But their duty was to observe without participating, to record without judging. This was not easy. Some diarists reported intense internal pressure to omit sensitive details or to protect a favored official. Others faced pushback when their records displeased superiors. Still, the institutional expectation was strict: objectivity, restraint, fidelity to fact. Failure to uphold this standard could result in dismissal, flogging, or worse. One record notes a scribe punished for altering a minister's quote to soften the tone. In Joseon, history was not just about truth, it was about accountability. Provincial scribes, bureaucracy in the fields. While the capital held the most prestigious scribes, thousands more worked across Joseon's 8 provinces in Mok, Gun, and Hyeon, administrative divisions equivalent to city, county, and village. These scribes documented land surveys, tax registers, population counts, marriage, birth, and death records, local disputes and punishments. Their work was compiled into ledger books, Djiankik, and sent to the capital quarterly. These bureaucrats were the nervous system of the state, transmitting raw data from village to throne. They were also frequently overworked, underpaid, and scapegoated for bureaucratic failures. If tax records didn't add up, the central court rarely blamed the magistrate, it blamed the record-keeper. And yet many took pride in their roles. One village scribe in 1801 wrote in the margin of a tax log, "If I write wrongly, the people suffer. If I write correctly, they suffer still. But at least they suffer not from my negligence." A bureaucrat's conscience scrawled in the dark. The art of formatting, precision as control. In Joseon bureaucracy, how you wrote was nearly as important as what you wrote. Scrolls followed exact formats. titles centered and framed, margins measured with cords, characters sized evenly, red ink used sparingly for royal comments or corrections. Deviation from format was considered disrespectful or suspicious. A badly formatted scroll might be rejected, even if its content was urgent. This rigidity reflected Confucian ideals, order, hierarchy, and respect for process. It also served a practical purpose. Uniform formatting made it easier to compare reports, verify authenticity, spot forgeries. Every document was a statement not just of information, but of loyalty to the system. Records as legacy and liability. While most records were dry numbers, names, dates, they could also become weapons. If a minister fell from favor, his past correspondence might be dredged up. If a land dispute reached court, old boundary logs would determine the verdict. And in the worst cases, records were used to justify executions. One tragic example is that of Crown Prince Sato, who was accused of madness and violence. In the aftermath of his death, sealed in a rice chest by royal decree, scribes were ordered to compile a record of his misdeeds. The final document was used to retroactively justify the execution. But it wasn't simple propaganda. The scribes included witness testimony, ministerial debate, and court precedent. They built a narrative that was both damning and documented. History was not written by victors, it was written by clerks. These were the bureaucrats of Joseon. They did not lead, they did not rule, they recorded. And in doing so, they left behind something kings could not: consistency, clarity, continuity. But what happens when even they are no longer trusted? When new regimes seek not preservation, but erasure? The fortress of Joseon was not only built of stone and soldiers. It was also built of paper, carefully stacked scrolls, meticulously copied ledgers, and archived orders housed in cool, shaded rooms behind locked doors. In these paper fortresses, a kingdom protected its truth, not just its power. We examine how Joseon's bureaucratic records were preserved, copied, and protected. We'll look at the institutional systems that turned fragile documents into an enduring memory, the dangers of political manipulation, and the survival of these scrolls through crisis and collapse. What begins as a simple act, writing something down, becomes, over time, a form of resistance against forgetting. The archives, more than storage. Records created by Joseon's bureaucrats didn't simply sit in drawers. They were carefully cataloged, copied, and stored in a tiered system of central and provincial archives. At the top was Jujingak, Kogyudunka, Inus, the royal library established by King Jeonjo in 1776. Located inside Changdeok Palace, Jujingak served as a repository for official court records, a research center for policy development, a reading room for hand-picked scholars. Below it were branch archives, including Ojujengek Outer Library, originally on Ganghwa Island, provincial archives maintained by each Mok, Gun, and Hyeon, special repositories for the Silak royal annals in mountain fortresses, as we've seen before. Documents were grouped by type. Ilgi ko ikienus, daily logs. Gongmun ko gongmunhenus, official government letters. Jairai ko gyodie enus, ritual protocols. Hajinkik ko hodungcha enus, village tax books. Suzikik ko susecha enu, population inspection books. Each item had a unique title, date, and seal essential for verifying authenticity. Loss of a scroll wasn't just a clerical error, it was considered dereliction of duty. Copying as insurance. Since fire, war, and moisture could easily destroy paper, Joseon developed an elaborate copying system. Original drafts were made by field scribes or court diarists. Clean copies were created by trained copyists, Sikikwen, who ensured formatting and handwriting consistency. Multiple copies were made. One for local use, one for provincial archives, one for Jujingak or royal libraries. For sensitive documents like royal edicts, carbon paper-style rubbing was used to replicate writing. Special inks and hanji paper made from mulberry bark ensured longevity. Copyists were trained not just in calligraphy, but also legal formatting and record retention procedures. Their role was clerical, but it required intellectual discipline and flawless attention to detail. The bureaucratic ideal was simple. Every event should exist in triplicate. Disaster and loss, fires, floods, and invasion. Despite these precautions, documents were often lost. One fire, palaces burned. Lightning strikes and unattended lanterns caused multiple fires in the 16th and 18th centuries. The Imjin War, 1592–1598, saw the destruction of Gyeongbok Palace and the loss of many early archives. In 1744, a blaze at Changdeok Palace destroyed a wing of Jujingak. Firewatch logs were introduced afterward. 2. Flood. Provincial records stored near riverbanks were often lost during monsoons. Some scribes buried scrolls in ceramic jars to protect them, only to have them rot underground. 3. Invasion and occupation. During the Japanese occupation, 1910–1945, many archives were seized or relocated. The Uegui ritual manuals were taken to Japan. Village tax records were destroyed as the new regime centralized taxation. Later, the Korean War, 1950–1953, led to further loss of local archives, especially in the north. Each loss was not just administrative, it was a fracture in memory. Manipulating the scrolls, bureaucracy under pressure. While many scribes held fast to impartiality, some documents were manipulated under political duress. One notable case involved the Sacho Draft History Office, where royal annals were compiled after a king's death. Though meant to be objective, these annals were written by those still alive and often under political pressure. If a king was unpopular at the time of his death, negative aspects of his reign were emphasized. If his faction still held power, flaws were downplayed. Sometimes, ministers attempted to alter records retroactively. After factional purges, new edicts were issued to correct errors in previous scrolls. One 18th century case notes a minister requesting that inflammatory remarks by his rival be omitted from the Seunjeongwen Ilgi. The request was denied. But once a document was sealed, it was the final word. The sanctity of scrolls, paradoxically, gave both safety and power. To have something written down was to fix it in history. Reading the scrolls, access and interpretation. Access to these records was tightly controlled. Only authorized officials could open the archives. Royal documents required special permission, often via a signed order. Copying sensitive records without approval was considered a capital offense. This created a paradox. The records were painstakingly preserved, but they were rarely consulted. Only during policy reviews, legal disputes, or succession crises were the archives opened. Even then, only a select few could interpret the classical Chinese, understand the document formatting, and trace the thread of context across years. Thus, the scrolls became repositories of silent authority, always there, seldom read. Women and record-keeping, hidden contributions. Though most scribes were men, court ladies Gungnieo played an important role in internal palace record-keeping, especially in the royal kitchen, wardrobe department, and quarters of the queen and concubines. They kept meal logs, recording the king's preferences and health. Garment inventories, tracking royal robes by season. Birth and death logs for royal offspring. These records were never part of the formal archives, but they were crucial for internal management. Some were later incorporated into larger compilations or referenced in the Uigui. Their work was rarely credited, but without it the palace wouldn't function. Their scrolls, like their labor, remained silent yet essential. What was not written? As rigorous as Joseon record-keeping was, it was not absolute. Peasant voices were rarely recorded, unless they appeared in legal complaints. Women's lives, unless connected to royalty or scandal, went undocumented. Crimes were recorded, but daily joys or emotions were not. This was not due to negligence but bureaucratic purpose. The scribes wrote what the system demanded: order, structure, law, ritual. Still, their scrolls give us the scaffolding of a society, its appointments, its anxieties, its repetitive needs. To read the annals is not to know the people, but it is to know what the state cared about. The bureaucrats of Joseon did not leave statues, they left ledgers. They did not inspire myths, they left margins. And somehow, centuries later, their silent scrolls still speak of a state trying to remember, a system trying to hold, a people trying to make each day legible. But what happens when these records, long preserved in archives, are finally open to the public? Who decides what they mean and who gets to tell the story they contain? The palace is long silent now. The ministers are gone. The king, long buried. But deep in an archive beneath layers of protective cloth, a scroll still rests, ink intact, paper unyellowed. It records the delivery of 400 sacks of barley to a mountain village in 1742. No poetry, no embellishment. Just a fact preserved, still waiting to be read. We explore the legacy of Joseon's record-keeping tradition as it enters the modern world. We trace how these quiet scrolls survived regime change, colonization, war, and digitization, and consider what happens when the once restricted becomes accessible to all. Because a record is never just what it says it is, what it means to those who find it later. Collapse, reform, and continuity. By the late 19th century, Joseon Korea was under immense pressure. Internal reform movements driven by corruption, famine, and frustration called for a modernization of the state. Foreign powers, especially Japan and Qing China, competed for influence. Reformers argued that the massive bureaucracy was bloated and outdated. The intricate system of paper records, daily reports, and court ledgers was seen as slow, opaque, and overly moralistic. As part of the Gabo reforms, 1894-1896, the traditional class-based civil service system was dismantled. Scribes and lower-tier bureaucrats, once the lifeblood of administration, were dismissed or reabsorbed into new roles. Some records were burned in protests. Others were lost during restructuring. Yet many scribes accustomed to writing even in obscurity kept recording. Some transitioned into modern clerks, continuing to log population data and land transactions under new ministry names. The script changed, the language changed, the intent remained. Colonial rule and the weaponization of records. When Japan annexed Korea in 1910, the fate of Joseon's bureaucratic legacy shifted again. Colonial administrators recognized the immense value of Korean records. Land ownership records were used to redistribute property, often unjustly. Household registration books were altered to facilitate taxation and surveillance. Royal annals and ritual records were shipped to Tokyo University and Japanese museums. Local archives were consolidated into colonial offices, with selective preservation based on Japanese administrative needs. Ironically, the very precision that made Joseon's bureaucracy effective also made it vulnerable. The colonial state used these detailed records to control, dispossess, and restructure Korean society. But again, some scribes persisted. Temple record-keepers, village elders, and displaced civil servants hid copies. A few smuggled Uigui volumes into monasteries. Others passed down knowledge orally or reconstructed tax ledgers from memory. They were not heroes in the dramatic sense. They were just people who couldn't stop writing things down. Liberation, war, and fragmentation. After Korea's liberation in 1945, efforts were made to reclaim and rebuild the national record. But the Korean War, 1950–1953, devastated what remained. Archives in the north were bombed or relocated. Southern repositories were evacuated in haste. Entire categories of civil documentation, births, marriages, land grants were lost forever. Rebuilding required a new generation of scribes trained not in calligraphy and classical Chinese, but in typewriters and forms. Ministries formed record restoration units. Surviving documents were collected from temples, private homes, and foreign libraries. Scholars began to cross-reference oral histories with archived scrolls, seeking continuity through fragments. And for the first time, public interest in old scrolls emerged. What had once been dry, bureaucratic record became a source of national identity. Translation and democratization of the scrolls. The greatest shift in the legacy of Joseon bureaucracy came not from scholars but from translators. Most original records were written in classical Chinese, legible only to a small elite. In the 1960s and 70s, the South Korean government began large-scale efforts to translate these scrolls into modern Korean, making them accessible to students, researchers, and eventually the general public. This effort included the Seunjeongwen Ilgi Project, translating the Royal Secretariat's daily journals; the Joseon Wangjo Silak translation, making the royal annals readable; digital indexing of ritual texts, Uigui; facsimile reproduction of tax and legal records. The process was slow and fraught with challenges. Obsolete vocabulary, ambiguous syntax, lack of context, contradictory accounts. And yet, the translators persisted, mirroring the original scribes in their quiet diligence. By the early 2000s, many major Joseon documents were available in Korean and later, in English and other languages. The once closed scrolls were now open. Digital archives, bureaucracy in the cloud. Today, much of Joseon's bureaucratic legacy is available online. Institutions like the National Institute of Korean History and Kyujingak Institute have digitized tens of thousands of pages, created searchable databases of names, dates, topics, provided high-resolution scans of scrolls and ledgers, developed interactive tools for comparing eras, laws, and events. Even schoolchildren can now browse royal meeting minutes or look up ancient tax laws with a few clicks. This is revolutionary. The most exclusive, controlled, and formal record-keeping tradition in Korean history has become accessible, searchable, and even editable, at least in commentary. But it also raises new questions. What does it mean to skim a record once written to be studied slowly? When everything is accessible, does anything feel sacred? The cultural legacy of the bureaucrat. Despite their obscurity, Joseon scribes have left an enduring mark on Korean culture. Their legacy can be felt in the Korean obsession with documentation, from receipts to birth certificates; the precision of modern civil service exams, still modeled on Confucian ideals of merit; the continuing respect for archivists, librarians, and behind-the-scenes professionals; the popularity of historical dramas, which often feature court recorders as key figures, silent, observant, morally conflicted. In some ways, the bureaucrat has become a Korean archetype: dutiful, overlooked, essential. Not the hero, not the villain, the one who remembers. Reflection: why the scrolls still matter. At first glance, Joseon's bureaucratic record-keeping might seem the height of tedium. Miles of ledgers, exacting formats, daily logs of royal meals and minor arguments. But look closer and you find something else. A vision of order sustained across 5 centuries. A belief that truth requires documentation. A commitment to process over power. The scribes were not fools. They knew their scrolls would not be read by most, but they also knew that history doesn't remember what isn't recorded. Today, in an age of data floods and forgotten files, their discipline feels almost sacred, not because they captured everything, but because they tried. They believed that memory was worth preserving, even when no one was looking. So the next time you dismiss a record as boring, a form as bureaucratic, or a scroll as irrelevant, consider this. The ink that preserved a kingdom wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to endure. Story 5. The Paper Tax, How Korea's Tax Collectors Calculated Rice and Grain. It's a warm spring morning in 17th century Korea. You are sitting beneath the tiled eaves of a county magistrate's office, a brush in your hand, a scroll at your side, and a line of farmers stretching into the yard. Each man approaches with a record, a tally of land, crop, and obligation. They speak softly. You write quickly. The rice harvest is still weeks away, but the tax year has already begun. This is the story of how Korea, during the Joseon dynasty, managed one of the most sophisticated yet quietly brutal tax systems in East Asia, not through soldiers or auditors, but through paper, ritual, and the patience of countless bureaucrats. This was the paper tax, a system that converted labor and land into numbers, and numbers into grain. It is a story not of dramatic revolts or sweeping reforms, but of how a civilization made math out of mud and policy out of weather. Why grain was power. In Joseon, Korea, the central unit of taxation was not coinage, it was grain, especially rice. Currency existed, of course, but it was scarce and unstable. Silver and copper coins were often hoarded or traded as goods, not as a state-backed medium of exchange. Instead, rice was king. It could be measured, stored, transported, consumed. Rice paid soldiers, fed officials, stocked granaries for famine relief, and flowed from provinces to the capital in convoys of ox carts and river barges. A well-managed rice tax meant state stability. A failed rice tax meant disaster. But before grain could move, it had to be counted. The basics of the tax system. At its core, Joseon's taxation model rested on a Confucian ideal. Each person owes the state according to their capacity. But as always, implementation was more complex. There were 3 main categories of tax. Land tax, jiance, paid in grain, based on size and type of land. Military cloth tax, gongbu, a household obligation, often fulfilled through cloth or coin. Labor tax, yak, replaced over time with surcharges or substitutions. Of these, the land tax was most central, but how was land measured? Unlike modern cadastral surveys, Joseon used a mix of field estimates by officials, farmer declarations, often underreported, registry books updated or forged over decades, soil classifications, dividing land into grades. All of this was logged, reconciled, and eventually recorded in tax ledgers, hojak, yangin, or deedingbu, stored at both local and provincial levels. And who managed this paper labyrinth? A small, often overlooked class of village clerks, regional recorders, and tax scribes, the literal bean counters of history. The mechanics of measurement. To determine how much tax a farmer owed, multiple variables were considered. Field size. Measured in jeol, ko gyelinus, a unit that changed over time and by region. 1 jeol could support a household under ideal conditions. Land quality. Fields were categorized into grades, ko sungsungdun enus, ko sungdungdun enus, ko chunghadun enus, etc., from best to worst. A higher grade yielded higher tax. Declared crop. paddy fields rice, were taxed more than dry fields barley millet. Exemptions. Certain classes scholars, soldiers, monks had partial or full exemptions, leading to disputes and tension. All of this was entered by hand into massive scroll registers, often copied multiple times for safekeeping. One example from 1682 reads, Farmer Kim, second-class land 3 Joel yield, 18 siak, tax due, 3.6 siak. A siak was roughly 180 liters, so Farmer Kim owed enough rice to feed several families for a month. And if he didn't pay? Collection, coercion, and corruption. Tax collection was rarely violent, but it could be relentless. Runners from the magistrate's office would deliver notices. Inspectors might visit fields to verify harvests and accept bribes. Deadlines were enforced seasonally, early spring for declaration, autumn for delivery. Late payment led to penalties, often another 10–20% in grain. Because of this, many farmers overpaid early to avoid risk later. Others underdeclared land, bribed clerks, or combined with neighbors to form mutual aid pacts. A black market of tax brokers emerged, men who, for a fee, would deliver your grain, ensure the paperwork, and smooth over problems with the local official. Some became quasi-bureaucrats in their own right. But abuse was common. Magistrates skimmed grain, granary keepers embezzled, ledgers were altered after the fact. In one preserved log from 1751, a scribe notes, a discrepancy of 4 siak observed. Clerk insists upon clerical error. No witnesses present, noted but unresolved. The paper tax system was designed for fairness, but often operated through negotiated ambiguity. The weight of the scroll. A full tax ledger could stretch several meters long. Carried in wrapped bundles, they were stored in magistrate vaults and provincial granaries. Each was labeled with year, village or district, scribe name, seal of the magistrate. And yet they were fragile. Rain, fire, and rodents could destroy years of data. As a result, copying was essential. Large county offices had full-time transcribers, whose job was to produce multiple backups, some for the capital, others for local use, and a few stored deep in administrative storerooms. If a dispute arose over taxes, these scrolls became legal evidence. If a fire destroyed them, tax records were reset, and farmers sometimes exploited this to erase debt. In famine years, these scrolls determined who got grain relief and who was ignored. Their weight was not in paper, but in life and hunger. The voice of the scribe. The clerks who managed this system were rarely honored. Often recruited from the Chungin class or rising commoners, they were trained in arithmetic, record formatting, calligraphy, legal precedent. They knew the law but worked under men who twisted it. Many left quiet notes in margins. Farmer protested amount, wife ill, no adjustment allowed. Inspector late, rain damaged harvest, clerk insists on full tax. Village elder offered chicken, declined, recorded nonetheless. These notes are rare. Most scrolls are silent, but in the rare places they speak, we glimpse the daily moral calculus of empire. In the world of the paper tax, ink ruled land. A field was not truly yours until it was written, measured, recorded, and taxed. But what happens when a new system arrives, one based not on fields and scrolls, but cash, banks, and standardized survey maps? The ink was still drying on this year's grain ledger when the first rumors reached the magistrate's office. Whispers that Seoul wanted the countryside to begin accepting payments not in rice, but in money, coin, metal, something that could not be eaten, could not be milled, and certainly could not be stored in a granary. For centuries, Joseon Korea had taxed its people in grain. This section explores the transformation of taxation as Korea began to modernize. It was a shift not just in economics, but in worldview from a nation that saw the land as the root of state power to one that saw currency and commerce as its new foundations. The change did not come all at once, and for many bureaucrats it was not welcome. The Didong Law, early reform attempts. The idea that the tax system needed reform wasn't new. As early as the 17th century, policymakers in the Joseon court saw problems in the grain tax system. In-kind collection created logistical nightmares. Local corruption flourished under vague assessments. Regional inequities caused resentment. The Didongbyup, called Dedongbup Anus, or Uniform Tax Law, was one major attempt to streamline taxation. First implemented in Gyeonggi Province in 1608 under King Gwanghwaegun, and eventually adopted nationwide by the late 17th century, the law shifted tax obligations from multiple items in kind, right arrow, a single payment in grain or cloth. This was simpler. It allowed better auditing. It also created space for middlemen merchants, known as gonggin, who fulfilled tribute quotas by supplying goods to the state in exchange for regional payments. But Didongbyup was still rooted in rice. Currency remained rare. Barter and grain defined the economy, and for most people, the idea of a coin-based tax was as abstract as the clouds. The introduction of currency, a slow arrival. By the 18th and 19th centuries, coinage became more common in market towns. Sampyeongtongbo, Kosungpyeongtongboenus, coins circulated as state-issued currency. Merchants preferred silver, especially imported Chinese taels. Some taxes began to be commuted into cloth or coin under local discretion. However, there was no unified currency policy. Rates of exchange between rice and coins varied wildly. A landowner in Jiala might pay entirely in rice, while a cloth merchant in Hanyang paid in bolts of fabric, both fulfilling tax, but through different systems. Bureaucrats were often confused. Ledgers included conversion tables between Siak, Nyang, Jiang, and Jian, each with local variations. One tax ledger from 1827 includes this marginal note. Rate for rice, 1 Siak equals 2.5 Nyang, this week only, adjust accordingly. Even among record keepers, money was a novelty, not a certainty. The paperwork multiplies. As currency entered the system, taxation became more complex, not less. Each grain payment now required a conversion ledger, rice right arrow, coin right arrow, delivery slip. A receipt stamped by the clerk, signed by the payee. A summary scroll showing totals across villages. A granary voucher to confirm grain had been received. Errors multiplied. Fraud increased. Disputes over fluctuating exchange rates clogged the magistrate's court. Clerks who had once needed only arithmetic now needed currency literacy. Some began informal bookkeeping schools to train junior scribes. Others retired early. The simplicity of harvest equals tax was fading. Merchant influence and tax farming. The introduction of money also meant the rise of the merchant class in tax collection. Known as Gyeonggian, called Gyeonghain, Enus, or tax contractors, these men advanced payments to local officials and then collected from the people, often with added interest. For the state, this ensured smoother cash flow. For farmers, it meant new layers of debt. One 19th century folk song from Gangwon-do captures the mood. The tax man comes with silver in hand, but takes my rice and leaves me land. He counts with coins I've never seen, and writes my name where I've not been. The paper tax, once a direct transaction between peasant and magistrate, was becoming monetized, outsourced, and harder to trace. Scribes began to log complaints more frequently. Rate disputed, farmer claims overpayment. Contractor absent, ledger incomplete. Clerk requested clarity on coin-to-grain ratio. No response from office. The bureaucratic system was straining under its own complexity. The rise of land registers. To control this chaos, the late Joseon government began formalizing land ownership records. Yangin ko Yangin Henus, detailed land cadastres showing ownership, size, grade, and tax liability. Hojak ko Hada Inus, household registration books linked to labor and military obligations. Each village maintained its own version, but central officials increasingly requested standardization. This meant more paperwork. Scribes were now not only tracking harvests but inheritance claims, land sales, boundary disputes. Each change required an amendment to the record, initialed by the magistrate and witnessed by the village head. One amendment from 1873 reads, Plot 14A, formerly owned by Park Yon, now to Kim Dal-soo, recorded per land deed submitted, tax reassigned as of next season. Land had always been political. Now it was documented down to the meter. Japanese occupation and system overhaul. The biggest break in Korea's taxation history came not from internal reform, but from external imposition. When Japan colonized Korea in 1910, they brought with them a radically different taxation ideology. Eliminate in-kind taxes, no more rice as tax. Standardize national land surveys. Centralize authority under colonial administrators. The 1912 Land Survey Project restructured the entire Korean tax landscape. Each plot was registered under a named owner. Taxes were assessed in currency, not grain. Scrolls were replaced by ledger books, stamped and indexed. Discrepancies between Joseon-era claims and new surveys were often ignored. The impact was immense. Land that had been held communally or informally for centuries was now owned by individuals, often Japanese settlers or their Korean collaborators. Scribes lost influence as taxation became a colonial function. The link between land, harvest, and obligation once central to Joseon was severed. The paper tax ended, but the legacy of its records remained. What survived the transition? Surprisingly, many scrolls were preserved. Local communities hid ledgers during surveys. Buddhist temples stored land deeds and tax records. Colonial offices kept pre-annexation scrolls as historical reference, some of which survive in modern archives. Today, these documents offer a rare window into the pre-modern Korean economy. Historians use them to study shifts in land ownership, regional production patterns, class mobility through land acquisition, the fiscal impact of Confucian social structures. And yet, for all their value, these scrolls still carry the quietness of their origins. They don't shout, they record. The Joseon scribes may never have imagined their tax scrolls would outlive their kingdom. That one day, their careful brushwork measuring harvests, settling disputes would be scanned, translated, and studied by scholars across the world. But they wrote anyway, carefully, consistently. Because even as money replaced grain and coins replaced siak, the belief remained. A nation lives or dies not by what it takes, but by what it remembers. Today, in a climate-controlled room in the Kyujingak archives at Seoul National University, lies a scroll. It is long, yellowed, and unassuming. A list of names, fields, and measurements runs across it in neat brushstrokes, unmarred by emotion or flourish. It records the harvest tax for a small village in 1793, a single year's bureaucratic memory. And yet this one document tells us who lived, who owned land, who paid, and who struggled. This final section reflects on the enduring legacy of Korea's grain-based taxation system, not as an outdated economic model, but as a window into daily life, state philosophy, and the subtle moral dimensions of record-keeping. As we follow the paper trail into modern times, we find that the quiet work of clerks and farmers still echoes in the way nations govern, measure, and remember. because a scroll is never just a scroll, it is the memory of a field, a bureaucratic ethos of precision. Unlike the more grandiose aspects of Joseon history, royal processions, military campaigns, or court intrigues, the taxation scrolls reveal a different Korea, one preoccupied with detail, measurement, and moderation. Each record represented a seasonal rhythm, spring declarations, fall payments; a communal process, village reporting, inspections, witness verification; a legal framework, exemptions, appeals, ledger notes; a moral expectation, to give according to ability, to receive according to need. The clerks who wrote these scrolls were expected to maintain objectivity and accuracy, but also to navigate compassion and fairness. A recorded reduction in tax due to flood damage wasn't just a number, it was acknowledgement of suffering. And when a farmer's name disappeared from a ledger due to death, migration, or dispossession, it was often the last official trace of that person's life. This quiet dignity underpins every brushstroke. Historians at the archive, what the scrolls tell us today. Modern researchers continue to glean vital information from surviving Joseon tax records. These scrolls help us understand demographics, family size, gender distribution, and household structures; agriculture, shifting crops, land productivity, and harvest cycles; inequality, disparities in landholding and regional tax burdens; social mobility, transitions from tenant to owner or vice versa. For example, one set of records from Gyeongsang province shows how a village's land shifted hands over 3 generations, from aristocratic landlords to commoner farming cooperatives, due to repeated floods and estate divisions. Another scroll reveals how, during a famine, a magistrate imposed a temporary 50% tax reduction, an act recorded in the margin, later confirmed by oral tradition in the same village. These details, dry on the surface, become living history when studied in full. And crucially, they offer a non-elite perspective. In an age when most writing was done by or for the literati, tax records captured the names, yields, and obligations of ordinary people. The paper tax and Korean identity. Even today, Korea's administrative systems reflect a lingering reverence for record-keeping. Detailed population registries that extend back to Joseon-era household books, hojak; meticulous land ownership databases rooted in the Yongan cadasters; a legal culture where written contracts and certificates remain paramount; a bureaucratic state where forms, approvals, and verification chains define much of daily life. In many ways, the paper tax system was less about taxation and more about creating a culture of governance through memory. Korea did not rely solely on force to control its provinces, it relied on paper, accountability, and the weight of written tradition. To be registered was to exist, to be taxed was to be seen. The disappearance of the scribe. As Korea modernized in the 20th century, the scribes who had once formed the backbone of tax administration faded from view. Their ink was replaced by typewriters and later computers; standardized forms, not brush scrolls; centralized ministries, not local magistrates; digital databases, not bound registers. Yet even as the tools changed, the mentality remained. Modern civil servants, especially in local government, continue to play roles reminiscent of Joseon-era scribes, balancing fairness and law, translating complex policies into everyday consequences, navigating between state authority and individual hardship. A modern tax office may look nothing like a wooden magistrate's hall, but the quiet tension between policy and person is much the same. The moral dimensions of tax. From the Confucian perspective, tax was not simply a tool for resource extraction, it was a test of the state's moral legitimacy. A ruler who taxed too heavily, or failed to distribute grain during famine, lost the mandate of heaven. This explains why Joseon scrolls often include margin notes recording exceptional cases. Omitted tax due to son's death. Woman is widow, assessed half share. Flood damage request for relief submitted. These notes show not only flexibility, but a deeply embedded belief that taxation should reflect not just the law, but the circumstances of life. In contrast to modern systems driven by income brackets or GDP, the Joseon system, however flawed, was rooted in ethics as much as math. From scrolls to screens, what we keep. Today, many of these ancient tax scrolls have been digitized. The National Institute of Korean History has uploaded thousands of images. Projects have transcribed and translated ledgers into modern Hangul. Some scrolls are featured in museum exhibits on agrarian life and governance. But digitization raises a new question. What do we lose when we convert scrolls into searchable databases? The margins, where human emotion once lived. The brushstrokes, which showed haste or care. The folds and stains, which told of use, neglect, or survival. What remains is data, what vanishes is texture. Even so, the existence of these scrolls in the public domain means the paper tax, once obscure, administrative, and boring, now plays a role in shaping how Koreans understand their past. In a society that prizes documentation, the act of remembering becomes as important as what is remembered. Reflection, a taxation of memory. In the end, Korea's paper tax system is remarkable not because it was efficient, it wasn't, or fair, not always, or simple, definitely not, but because it endured. It endured through regime changes, famines and wars, colonial surveys, modernization, digitization. Why? Because thousands of anonymous scribes, farmers, and magistrates believed in the act of recording. They believed that to write a name, a field, or a payment was to affirm that something had happened, that someone had lived, that labor mattered. And so, across centuries, they filled scroll after scroll not with stories but with facts. And those facts, quiet though they were, became the foundation of a nation. So next time you sign a form, pay a bill, or submit a tax return, remember that behind every modern number lies a scroll. And behind every scroll, a man with a brush, under a leaky roof, trying to capture life in ink. Story 6. Threads of Power, the Bureaucracy Behind Royal Robes. You might imagine a royal robe as a symbol of opulence, glorious dragons embroidered in gold thread, deep indigo silks shimmering in candlelight, a proud king seated at court while lesser men bowed. But behind that symbolism was an army of hands, a bureaucratic machine, and an exacting system of protocols that turned silk into power. This is the story of Korea's royal clothing bureaucracy, a meticulous network of textile officials, artisan guilds, and administrative clerks who turned cloth into statecraft. The robes worn by kings, queens, and court officials were not just garments, they were codified instruments of political legitimacy. They measured authority in centimeters, they counted dignity in layers, and they dyed sovereignty into bolts of silk. This section explores the foundations of this system, how garments were planned, materials sourced, and colors imbued with political weight. Because before a king could rule, someone had to weave his sleeves. The role of clothing in Joseon statecraft. Clothing in Joseon Korea was never just clothing. It was a social signifier, dictating who could wear what colors, fabrics, and patterns. A ritual object, worn at ancestral rites, royal weddings, and court ceremonies. A legal item, regulated by sumptuary laws under the Confucian bureaucracy. In the court, every robe had a name and a manual. These included Ganryampo Kogoncheonpo Inus, dragon robes for the king. Hwangwansum Ko Hwangwansum Inus, yellow ceremonial dress for queens. Dalyong Kodentyang Inus, round collar robe for civil officials. Chialik Kochali Inus, military robe more practical in design. Wansam and Dangui, court dress for women of the royal family. Each robe came with strict guidelines. Number of claws on a dragon. Only the king could wear 5-clawed dragons. Embroidery pattern, cranes, phoenixes, plum blossoms, waves. Placement of insignias, back, chest, sleeves. Length and width of sleeves, precisely recorded in court manuals. These were not arbitrary. They were codified in the Gukjo Oryui, called Gutsuatyui Enus, and Uigui, called Ui Wenus, state ritual books that prescribed down to the inch what every official should wear for every conceivable occasion. But someone had to enforce these rules. Someone had to make the garments, and someone had to keep the ledgers. The Seianbu and the bureaucracy of cloth. The production of royal robes was overseen by a division of the central government known as the Seianbu, called Suanbu Enus, often translated as the Office of Royal Attire or the Bureau of Royal Wardrobe. Its duties included planning and approving robes for royal events, managing inventories of silk, hemp, thread, dye, and accessories, contracting artisan workshops from state guilds, inspecting quality and dimensions of finished garments, maintaining the royal laundry and storage rooms. This office worked closely with other bureaus, including Jeonjo Gamyong Kochundahamyong Enus for fiscal budgeting of materials, Jamyo Juriadagam Kochomyo Enus for ritual coordination, Uigui editors for documentation of ceremonial garments and procedures. It was not enough to make the robe. One had to plan, document, justify, and archive it. This ensured that royal garments weren't just fine, they were legally legitimate and ritually valid. And behind this system stood clerks, poring over scrolls, matching measurements, and tracking fabric shipments from textile workshops across the country. Textile guilds and artisan labor. While the bureaucracy approved designs and materials, the actual work of weaving and sewing fell to state-managed artisan guilds, known as Gongan, Kolgongin, Enus. These included weavers of silk Jagakgong, dyers who specialized in indigo, red, and the coveted golden yellow Yeonjagong, embroiderers who worked in brush-thin silk thread, Subangong, tailors who cut according to state measurements, Poyangong, accessory makers who crafted buttons, belts, and hat insignia, Jeonjagong. Each artisan worked under a quota system. For example, during a royal wedding, an official order might be issued. 3 yellow robes, 8 wedding veils, 12 embroidered sashes, to be delivered by the 15th day of the 9th month. Delays were penalized. Mistakes were punished. Success brought small honors and extra payment of rice or a certificate of merit. The guilds operated like quiet factories, though some were no larger than family workshops. Their products were delivered to the capital in sealed bundles, accompanied by documents certifying origin, material content, and intended wearer. Nothing was casual. A queen's sash had to be dyed from the correct species of safflower, harvested at the correct time, and boiled in a precise ratio to yield the imperial red. A slight variation meant rejection and an entry in the error log. The science of dye and color politics. Color was not just aesthetic, it was symbolic law. Certain colors were reserved. Yellow Kohwangse, Inus, reserved exclusively for the monarch, drawn from gardenia or turmeric dyes. Red Kochuhong Inus, used in ceremonies, worn by royalty and high court women. Blue Kochungse Inus, used for civil officials. Black and white, used for mourning or scholarly events. Each dye involved a painstaking process. Indigo for blue robes required fermentation over several days, using lye and aged plant matter. safflower and gardenia were seasonal and had to be imported from specific provinces. Gold embroidery required beating thin sheets of gold leaf into thread form. Artisans needed not just skill, but chemical understanding, passed down in apprenticeships. Records from 1783 show a dispute where a batch of purple robes turned too brown, the fault traced back to a dyer who substituted a cheaper mordant. The entire order was rejected. The dye house was fined. The paper trail of cloth production was as thick as the robe itself. The Book of Measurements. One of the most fascinating artifacts of this system is the Sangui Jiangryong Dosal, called Sanguidongjang Dosainus, or the Illustrated Manual of Royal Garments. This document includes diagrams of robes, hats, sashes, and even socks, detailed annotations of width, length, sleeve girth, and layering requirements, tables showing seasonal variations, lighter fabric for summer, quilted silk for winter, protocols for dressing assistants, how many attendants, which order, who touches the robe last. Everything was measured. If a robe deviated from the manual, it could not be worn in a state ceremony. As such, tailors often worked in silence, with the manual open beside them, their every stitch corresponding to a specific page, line, and measurement. And so, before a crown prince could bow to his ancestors, before a queen could enter her marriage chamber, before a king could ascend his dragon throne, a ledger had to be written. Cloth had to be measured. A dye pot had to boil. No robe was worn in Joseon that had not first passed through a web of paper, ink, and silent calculation. But what happened to these robes after they were worn? Were they preserved, recycled, buried, destroyed? The royal robe, once made, did not simply hang in a closet waiting for use. It was entered into a register, wrapped in protective cloth, and stored in the temperature-controlled rooms of the Nimyongbu, called Nemyongbu Inus, the women's quarters of the palace where attendants and high-ranking court ladies cared for the royal wardrobe like a sacred archive. In this section, we explore the ritual and practical life cycle of the royal garments, from how robes were issued for ceremonies to how they were tracked, worn, stored, or if necessary destroyed. We follow the paperwork and people that maintained this part of Joseon's quiet machine of royal dignity. Because the robe was not just a garment, it was a moving symbol, and once worn, it became part of living history, a moment recorded in cloth. Issuing robes for ceremony. Every use of a royal robe required a formal process. For major state events, weddings, investitures, ancestral rites, diplomatic receptions, the Board of Rites, called Yedo Inus, would issue a formal requisition to the Seiunbu and palace seamstresses. A typical process included request form, called Uibot Chungtuksainus, submitted to the palace wardrobe staff indicating the robe, size, event, and required accessories. Approval, verified by the appropriate minister or senior palace woman. Ledger entry, the robe's identification number, previous uses, condition, and inspection result were logged. Preparation, robes were aired, checked for damage, and ironed with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Inspection by ritual officer, final confirmation that garment matched the protocol specified in the Uigui for the event. Each step produced documents, slips, ledgers, stamps, or sign-offs. Palace assistants were trained to handle not just fabric but the bureaucratic choreography surrounding it. Wearing the wrong robe or the right robe with the wrong sash could invalidate an entire ritual. The ceremony of dressing. Dressing a monarch or queen was a solemn, choreographed event. A team of attendants and high-ranking court women, known as sangung, were assigned specific roles. One prepared undergarments. Another held the outer robe. A third tied the belt or sash, ensuring it lay precisely. A fourth would adjust the headwear, whether a dragon-embroidered ixiongwen, called iksungwen inus for kings, or a jeweled jokjuri called choktudi inus for queens. Every motion was practiced. The left sleeve always went on before the right. Robes were never touched from the front, but from behind. The final adjustment was made in silence, usually by the most senior sangam. All this was done under the supervision of a ritual officer, sometimes accompanied by a record keeper, who would note the time of dressing, the robe used, and any unusual occurrences. Example entry from a royal wedding. 4th hour of the day, the queen consort was dressed in hwangwansum with triple-layered underrobe, collar adjusted twice. Ceremony began at 6th hour. To wear a robe was to enter a script where posture, color, fabric, and time were all part of a greater equation. When robes became sacred, some robes once worn were treated as sacred relics. This included enthronement garments, often preserved in state storage for generations. Ritual robes used in Jongmyo ancestral rites, believed to carry spiritual residue. Wedding garments of queens, sometimes passed on or stored in ritual pavilions. Such garments were often not reused. Instead, they were wrapped in multiple layers of muslin and silk, stored in labeled lacquered boxes, placed within sealed palace storerooms, sometimes under lock and ritual blessing. The registry would include date of last use, name of wearer, condition, ritual function. In cases where a monarch died, the robe used during their final rites might be burned or buried, depending on the era's custom and spiritual interpretation. Sometimes the robe was interred with the monarch, and its description included in the burial inventory. These entries were exact. Buried with His Majesty, 1 red silk dragon robe, 5-clawed embroidery, inner layer quilted, collar stiffened with deer hide. Condition, excellent. Recycling and reuse, the robe's afterlife. Not all royal garments were permanent treasures. In fact, most were recycled. Joseon was a Confucian state, frugal, measured, and deeply mindful of waste. Robes used for minor ceremonies, seasonal functions, or staff uniforms were often disassembled, patched, or cut into. Children's robes for palace boys. Shrouds for minor funeral rites. Curtains or bedding in lesser-used rooms. Offerings to temples, especially if the robe had ritual value. Some fabrics, particularly high-grade silk, were too valuable to discard. Instead, they were re-dyed and used in lower-ranking robes, a kind of textile downgrading system. 1 ledger from 1821 lists 3 purple official robes, faded, reassigned for use as underlayers in dangui dress, fabric relined, record amended. Nothing was lost, every hymn had an afterlife. But these changes had to be approved, and that approval produced more records. When robes were destroyed, certain circumstances required the complete destruction of royal garments. These included contamination by death or illness. Robes worn during fatal illnesses or deathbed rituals were burned as a spiritual safeguard. Political disgrace. If an official or royal consort fell from grace, their garments might be destroyed along with their portraits and seals. End of dynasty rituals. During periods of major regime change, some robes were ritually burned to signal the end of an era. The destruction was never casual, it followed a process. An order was written, citing reason and authorizing official. A witnessed burning was conducted sometimes by palace guards, sometimes monks. A record was entered into the garment's ledger, destroyed by fire cause, illness. Ashes were occasionally buried or sent to a temple. These were robes that no longer had a place in the world. Their political meaning expired, their symbolism too dangerous or sacred to remain. Storage and preservation. Those robes that survived were kept with obsessive care. Rooms were kept dry, shaded, and free of insects. Each robe was wrapped in a standardized cloth cover, with a tag listing year and type. Boxes were stacked by use, not color or beauty. Every quarter, palace clerks conducted inspections. If a robe showed signs of decay, it was marked for mending, rewriting its entry in the wardrobe ledger. Examples: silk fray on left sleeve, repaired by court seamstress, inspected and approved. Yellow robe sun-faded on collar, scheduled for re-dyeing. One record from the late 1800s even notes concerns about mold in summer months, and the use of smoke fumigation, an early version of pest control. To preserve the robe was to preserve the symbol of the state itself. The silent workers of the wardrobe. At the heart of this system were the Sangung high-ranking court women whose job was to manage, track, and protect the garments. These women memorized every robe's history, could identify silk origin by touch, understood protocol better than many male officials, served for decades with no public recognition. Their ledgers survive, many signed with tiny marks or initials, sometimes in ink so light it vanishes under glass. A robe's elegance might have been visible to all, but the bureaucracy that protected it was nearly invisible. An undressed kingdom. As the 20th century dawned and the monarchy declined, many royal robes were lost. Some were sold during Japanese colonization, looted or donated to shrines, taken abroad, ending up in private collections. Only a handful remain in Korea today, preserved in museums or as national treasures. But far more numerous are the record scrolls, manuals, and wardrobe ledgers that detail where each robe went, how it was made, and who wore it. In those quiet documents, the dynasty still wears its robes. What did it mean when robes disappeared from ceremonies altogether? When presidents replaced kings, and black suits replaced embroidered dragons? What happened to the measurements when no one measured anymore? The last Joseon king to wear a full ceremonial ganryangpo, the famed five-clawed dragon robe, was Emperor Gajang, seated beneath painted clouds during a coronation that was more symbolic than sovereign. The ceremony, documented in excruciating detail, was already out of step with a world that had moved toward cameras, telegraphs, and treaties written in Western languages. We trace the twilight of royal garments, how they faded from power, how they were stolen, sold, or sealed away, and how Korea's textile bureaucracy left behind a legacy of invisible threads. Though the robes are mostly gone, the mindset that created them, the meticulous care, reverence for ritual, and quiet preservation of status, continues to ripple through Korean culture and governance. Because once you've dressed a kingdom, it's not so easy to undress it. The empire's last robes. In 1897, after centuries under the Joseon banner, King Gajang declared himself the Emperor of Korea, Dihin Jeguk, elevating the monarchy's status in the hope of fending off colonial powers. With this came a redesign of ceremonial garments, an imperial purple robe, with gold dragons more elaborate than any used before. The newly designed robes featured broader sleeves, thicker embroidery threads, emblems merging traditional Confucian symbolism with more imperial Chinese influences, heavier layering for gravitas in photographs. But these robes were mostly performative, created in the shadow of encroaching Japanese colonial pressure. They were worn at coronations, diplomatic receptions, and even in studio portraits meant to circulate internationally. No longer tools of internal state governance, the robes had become costumes of international legitimacy. The tailors still measured, the Sangung still dressed their monarch, and the clerks still logged it all, but the robes were no longer backed by sovereignty. A robe without power is just thread. Colonial disruption and displacement. With Japan's formal annexation of Korea in 1910, the royal bureaucracy was dismantled. The Seiunbu was abolished. State-managed guilds were either shut down or co-opted into colonial industry. Robe storerooms were looted, catalogued, or burned. Many royal garments were taken to Japan, some displayed in museums, others kept in private collections. Palace women who once cared for robes were dismissed, married off, or forbidden from continuing their work. A robe that once required 15 people to produce was now worth more as a collector's item than a cultural symbol. Several Ganryangpo robes, both real and ceremonial replicas, ended up in Tokyo National Museum, private estates of Japanese nobles, auction catalogs in Europe and America. Others simply vanished. What remained in Korea were fragments, sleeves, embroidered panels, sashes without provenance, orphans of ceremony, disconnected from their purpose. Even the records, the ledgers, manuals, inspection reports were subject to censorship or destruction. Yet some survived, hidden by former bureaucrats, monks, or royal descendants. These pages are now among the most vital resources in reconstructing Korea's lost textile heritage. Robes without thrones, the 20th century. Despite the abolition of the monarchy, robes occasionally resurfaced in the 20th century for symbolic purposes. State funerals of former royals included brief displays of surviving garments. During the Korean War, some surviving robes were transported south for safekeeping, only to be lost in fires or looting. In the 1960s and 70s, the Korean government and cultural institutions began tracing missing artifacts, resulting in the return of several royal garments. A pivotal moment came when a complete Ganryangpo robe, believed to be from King Gajong's era, was recovered from a private estate in Japan and repatriated. Its inner lining contained an ink inscription, noting the event and date of wear, a rare confirmation of authenticity. As these robes returned, conservators faced a challenge. How do you preserve silk, nearly 150 years old? Can robes be displayed without compromising them? What stories can be told with fabric alone, if the bureaucracy that recorded them is gone? In many cases, the solution has been to exhibit the records alongside the garment's ledger beside sash, drawing beside sleeve, allowing the public to see not just the robe, but the system that made it matter. Reconstruction and cultural memory. Today, Korea's royal garments are undergoing a slow renaissance, not in politics, but in cultural education, reenactments, and museum preservation. Modern projects include the National Palace Museum of Korea, which houses reconstructed and original royal robes. The Uegui Restoration Project, which digitizes the court's ritual manuals, including robe instructions. Textile guilds, re-established by cultural preservationists, using traditional looms and natural dyes. Reenactments at Gyeongbokgung Palace, where actors in faithful replicas perform royal ceremonies. In each case, the goal is not just visual accuracy but fidelity to the process. Dyes must follow old recipes. Stitching must follow original diagrams. Even the wrapping cloths are replicated. In this way, Korea's textile bureaucracy lives on not as a functional system of governance, but as an ethos. Precision, protocol, preservation, the bureaucratic afterlife. The attitudes embedded in the clothing system continue to echo in modern Korean society. Uniformity and hierarchy in school uniforms and civil service dress codes. Respect for proper occasion and appearance in social functions. The continued dominance of detailed procedural documentation in both government and private business. In other words, the robe is gone, but the administrative mindset remains. Even the concept of beauty in Korea, clean lines, balanced proportions, subtle symbolism, bears traces of Confucian textile aesthetics. In fashion, ceremony, and daily appearance, the ghost of the robe lingers. A robe in the archive. One surviving Hwangwonsum, Queen's yellow robe, lies preserved today under low light in a sealed case. It is stunning. Layered silk, gold embroidery in lotus and phoenix patterns, tiny knots holding threads in perfect tension. But it is the label beneath the robe that tells the true story. Produced by government order, 1887. Used in royal marriage ceremony. Stitch count recorded in Ledger 132B, recovered 1965, returned 1971. There it is again, the robe and the paper that made it real. Without the ledger, this would be just a beautiful old costume. With it, it becomes an act of memory. Reflections, what is lost, what is woven. In the end, the royal robe system of Joseon, Korea, was never just about fabric. It was about order, meaning, continuity. The robe was the state made visible. Bureaucrats wrote its rules. Artisans realized its form. Palace women preserved its dignity. And yet, for all its beauty, the robe could not prevent collapse. Kingdoms fall, threads fray. But when something is woven deeply enough into a culture, it doesn't disappear. It transforms. Today, even in a digital republic, Korea remains a place where forms must be filled just so. Ceremonies must be correct in form and order. Titles, dress, and roles matter visibly and invisibly. These are the threads that remain. And so, the story of Korea's royal robes is not simply one of silk and embroidery, but one of memory stitched into the soul of a nation. Because long after the king is gone, someone still knows how long his sleeve should be.